mics are on, so Eric, do you know if the video is rolling?
What?
The video is rolling?
I'll check real quick.
Good evening. I'm going to call to order the special meeting of the Planning Board on December 3rd, 2019. This is a special meeting called by the City Council for the Planning Board to review proposed text language, an amendment to a section of Chapter 60. We'll begin with a roll call, and we'll begin on my far left.
Kyle Pepin.
Matt Duvall.
Brian Carrier.
Evan Sear.
John Engler.
Katie Boss.
Tonight we have Dan Carroll absent and Stephen Martelli absent. For that reason, our associate members, Mr. Pepin and Mr. Engler, will be elevated to full voting members of the board for the remainder of the meeting. We have 5 public hearings on our agenda tonight. These public hearings, this agenda was set by the City Council. We will go through each hearing by first hearing a staff report. We will then open it up to members of the board may ask staff questions. We will open it up to public input. Then after that, we will discuss amongst the board and make our motions, and that is how we will proceed through each of the public hearings tonight. To that end, is staff ready to begin their presentation? Do you have something that you would like to present prior to the?
I think it would be helpful because the public hearings really are on items that are intended to function as a package of amendments. Approving one and not approving another at the council level really wouldn't deliver the outcome that the package was intended to deliver. They need to be consistent with each other. If we say in one place in the ordinance that farms are allowed on lots less than 10 acres, but then in another place we say you can't have a building on a lot less than 10 acres, those inconsistencies wouldn't work well. So it would be helpful if I can do a general overview of kind of how we got to where we are today, a general overview of the changes, and then as we go to each public hearing, I can summarize the changes in that specific section.
All right, are there any objections to having sort of a historical context? None being?
So the planning board has had this on their agenda for quite a while now, off and on. 2 councils ago, we did what's known as the Crossroads study for the agriculture and natural resource economy. Then the current council and mayor had initiated the process that was called the MAGARP group, Mayor's Action Group on Agriculture Resource Protection. They worked through a long discussion about potential changes. The changes that came out of that process went to the City Council and then came before this board back in June. And this board and the Conservation Committee made some recommendations on those proposed changes. Both of those groups, the Planning Board and the Conservation Committee, had found some issues with those and didn't recommend that they be passed the way that they were proposed. Since then, staff has been working directly with the City Council, probably a dozen or more meetings over the last 3 or 4 months, with the City Council meetings and workshops combined. And we've arrived at a new draft that went to the council for first reading last night. It's not it's a little unusual as far as process for the council to do a first reading before they hear from the planning board, but it is an allowable way to do it. And it kind of gives you, I think, as a board, the benefit at least of knowing how the council reacted to the draft at first reading before you provide your recommendations that will go back to the council at second reading. At the June review of the previous version of the ag amendments, the planning board had identified, based on the comprehensive plan and the discussion at the board, had identified a set of criteria that you had used at that time to measure any proposed changes, to first decide what you wanted to achieve and what you wanted to avoid, and what the comp plan called for achieving versus avoiding. And I think this board did a good job of laying that out as sort of the base work before you got into the details of the ordinance. And my suggestion would be that you use those criteria or a similar set of criteria to measure the current proposed ordinances and decide whether or not the board supports them or thinks there should be changes or doesn't support them. The objectives that were identified at the June meeting, number one was a reduction in the 50% income rule should be addressed, that it was not appropriate in this era. That was consistent with the comp plan's objective of modernizing the income standard to meet the needs of today's agriculture. The board had decided in June to measure those standards against the idea that the new standard does not promote residential use, that the residential uses should remain accessory to agriculture. I think I can zoom in a little more on that. It's probably easier to read on my screen than it is on yours. Number three was that any changes should not spur sprawl or growth in the rural areas of the city. Essentially, the comp plan also had recommended that we limit growth in the agricultural areas and concentrate it in the areas where the city decides that they want it. The fourth criteria that the board had used was that changes must not favor either small scale or large scale agriculture. Neither should be negatively impacted by a change. Kind of a fairness measure against the different scales of agriculture. And the fifth one was that forestry and other conservation use may need to be considered differently, as the unintended consequences have resulted in 75% forested land, that's within the ag zone, 75% of it is forested, that is now home to wildlife populations. Large tree farming and or development will push wildlife into farming operations and or urban areas, and the board's goal was to avoid a result of dramatic loss in wildlife populations or hunting grounds. And the board used those 5 standards to measure the proposals that were before you at that time. Certainly have the option of amending those, but I think they were well-grounded standards, grounded by the comp plan, grounded by the board's discussion at that time, and they worked well for making an objective decision. The current proposal is, the way that we broke it out in public hearings is broken out into 3 sections. The reason for that is we weren't sure if there was agreement on all the sections, and as we were going through the workshops, we were trying to find consensus on individual sections, and we kept them as separate items as they went through the council discussion last night. I apologize, I didn't update the date on this, but this is the same presentation that was used for the council last night, and it provides a good summary of the current status of the proposed changes. The proposals that are in front of you tonight and were reviewed by the council last night is to change the income criteria from the current 50% of household income to 30% of household income. Perhaps the largest change that's proposed as part of this is this new idea of adding an option to use the median household income instead of purely the individual household income. The goal of that really is what we had with the existing standard when it's purely measured against household income is if you have a household that has at least one earner that earns a large off-farm income, then the amount of income that they, as a household, whether it's one of the members of the household or as a group, would have to earn from agriculture is larger because they have a larger off-farm income than it would be for somebody with a smaller farm income. It was a fairness thing. And also the idea that most of the new farms in Maine are smaller farms, and many of those smaller farms rely on off-farm income. And staff saw, as recommending this change, staff saw the median Auburn household income as an opportunity to modernize the zone as the comp plan had envisioned and sort of equalize that income level so that a family could become a farm family for the purposes of building a house and have an equal standard regardless of their off-farm income. I think it's likely that new farms in the future will have substantial off-farm incomes in order to be sustainable as a farm, and the choice to farm is partly a lifestyle choice and not necessarily the primary income source of the family. The median Auburn household income is $46,976 per the Crossroads report, which was the last decennial census. That would result with a 30% income standard in a requirement that a farm family earn just over $14,000 a year in gross farm revenues, the way the ordinance is written, in order to qualify for building a home. The proposed changes removes livestock requirement. Within the definition of a farm, there were specific numbers of certain types of animals that were required to qualify as a farm. That gets removed as part of the current changes, and added that 5 acres of land, contiguous land, would be required in order to build a home accessory to a farm. That's a loosening of the standard now, that in order to build any structure in the ag zone, other than some small agricultural buildings, you have to have at least 10 acres. So that was a reduction in that standard. 2 council workshops ago, there were concerns raised within the Lake Auburn Watershed overlay.
May I interrupt? 'Cause
Certainly.
I'm now confused. So if we go back to the prior slide, it says that the 14,093 is based on farming revenue,
Yes.
but I thought we were talking about farming income.
So I think that's an important distinction to understand and to maybe incorporate into your recommendation. But the current draft ordinance is that it would be 14, if the 30% is the income standard, that it would be $14,000 in gross farming revenue or income, but it's not a net figure. So it's not a figure that's calculated revenues minus expenses for an actual profit. It's gross farming income, the way that it's drafted.
And the current ordinance is based on income, correct?
The current, it's income, but it's not net income. It is farm revenues as income. But the 50%.
I hadn't understood that.
It has been gross farm income or revenues in the current ordinance as well. And that number gets smaller with this standard, but it's still currently drafted as a gross revenue standard, not as a net or profit standard. The Lake Auburn Watershed overlay came up as a question a couple of workshops ago at the council. So last night, for the first time, we presented an amendment to the Lake Auburn Watershed overlay that would essentially keep the current 50% income standard in place as is within land in the Lake Auburn Watershed overlay. The Water District and Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission had provided testimony about that concern, and the council had instructed staff to draft that for consideration last night. That did pass first reading last night. As you can see here on the screen, the section that was added says residential dwellings. You could construe that to apply, and I think pretty easily construe that to apply to all land within the Lake Auburn watershed where it was intended to only apply to agricultural resource protection zoned land and not to residential zones that exist in the Lake Auburn watershed. Staff is suggesting that we clarify that here on second reading at the council So this section is titled Residential Dwellings in the Agriculture and Resource Protection Zoning District. There was never an intention on the part of staff, and from what I gather from the council, and we have representative from the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission, to prohibit residential dwellings further than already allowed in that district on residentially zoned land. But there was a clear desire to not loosen the standard on agriculturally zoned land for residential dwellings. The other substantial change to this ordinance is currently you can only build principal structures on lots that exceed 10 acres in the agricultural zone. The council had asked for an exception for 3 to 10 acre lots initially, and then as they worked through their process, that got changed to 5 to 10 acre lots, so that somebody could propose a farm on a lot less than 10 acres that existed as of January 1, 2018. They wanted to make sure there were no new lots created less than 10 acres, but there was a desire to allow some flexibility for a residence tied to a farm on a lot that's less than 10 acres. What we did to accomplish that was we proposed a special exception standard that would require on lots less than 10 acres that a person propose a farm plan and meet a number of standards in the ordinance that the planning board would judge with some assistance from this the proposed agricultural committee in determining if the farm plan is feasible, if the lot could likely accommodate their farm plan. Somebody would propose it would go to the ag committee. The ag committee would provide a recommendation on the set of criteria in the ordinance, and we'll get into the details on those when we get to that section. That would then come to the planning board, so you would be the ultimate body to approve an exception on a lot less than 10 acres if somebody was applying for a house permit tied to a farm. The benefit of that process, the special exception process from the council standpoint, was they wanted abutters to be notified and to be able to provide input on a proposal. And they also wanted feedback from an ag committee before something like that was approved. And it also, we changed it based on this last section so that it could not happen in the Lake Auburn watershed. So that preserves the 10 acre minimum and the 50% income standard in the Lake Auburn watershed. This was the schedule that we explained again to the council last night. We've been sort of dropping off the earlier meetings as they pass. Tonight is the December 3rd special planning board meeting. We're looking for you to review the proposed changes, hold a public hearing on each one of them, and then provide a recommendation to the council. That will then go to the December 9th council special meeting for a second reading and public hearing for the Lake Auburn overlay changes, the changes to the Ag Resource Protection Zoning District. That's the farm definition, the use regulations and the definitions, dimensional standards, the way that it's broken out, and also would be a second reading on the creation of an ag committee at the December 3rd meeting. You guys have already provided a recommendation on that, but that would all go back to the council on the 9th. As far as specific recommendations from my perspective as staff, it would really be helpful that you look at each section and provide specific recommendations on those, but also it would be helpful if you weighed in on the idea that the Lake Auburn watershed overlay currently says residential dwellings. Staff recommends that it be changed to say residential dwellings in the Ag Resource Protection District, so that's clear. And also last night at the council, the definition standards passed by a vote of 5-2. Then the use regulations passed by a vote of 4-3. And then the dimensional standards failed by a vote of 3-4. Our attorney says that that could still work. but it would be cleaner if there was consistency that either the whole package works or it's adjusted to be adopted in some other way, but that it remains consistent, because the votes that happened last night would say in one place that you can propose a farm on a 5 to 10 acre lot, but then in another place it would retain the language that says you can't propose a building on a lot less than 10 acres, and that conflict on lots between 5 and 10 could cause some problems. With that, I'd be happy to answer any general questions, and then we can look at the specific language for each section as we go through the public hearings.
Are there any general questions? Before we begin, I have a question for the board. Mr. Cousins proposed using the previously developed planning board objectives. It's I think that suggestion has merit. Would you be willing to put those back up on the screen? So these 5 planning board objectives were developed after review of the comprehensive plan and current ordinance. And I think they at least give us a framework. I think it's reasonable if there's something that we would like to add or possibly change. But it was incredibly helpful the last time we reviewed something to say, these are the objectives we believe any change to the ag zone must meet. And that those objectives were based on the comprehensive plan. Because we cannot suggest something that is at odds with the comprehensive plan, essentially. So, before we begin, I think we need to have a short discussion. Are these something that we would like to use as a set of criteria? And so, it can't be just me speaking. If we're going to choose to do this, we have to have a discussion. So.
Well, I'll comment that I'm fairly certain that these recommendations were an inheritance of prior to when I joined the board earlier this year. Nonetheless, through everything I've learned about the issue, I think that these were wise recommendations to have developed at the time, and I think this is a great framework to use.
I think it's good to use the same framework as we've used in the past.
Agree. I think that the framework we'd already developed is just as the way we need to address it.
I agree, these are fine.
I definitely agree. Yeah.
All right. I think, honestly, we've given ourselves a leg up in this process then. As we go through, well, we don't have any printed copies. As we go through, we do have the language in front of us. Perhaps we can have the presentation from staff on the language, the text amendment itself, and then bring this back up so that way, as a planning board, we can make determination whether or not we believe that language that is proposed meets these objectives. Does that work for staff?
Yep, I was just opening the website to pull up that language.
All right. It looks like we're ready to begin our first hearing. The first hearing is on amendments to Chapter 60, Section 60-2, definitions in the Agriculture and Resource Protection District. So, are we ready for the staff report?
I'll have the language up here on the screen in a second, but essentially in the definitions section, the change is to remove the income standard from the definition. Our attorney has recommended that it belongs elsewhere in the use standards. It's not a great idea to have performance standards in the definition section of your ordinance. It's better to have them in the section that governs how a use is approved or not approved. We've done that with the proposed changes. We've also eliminated the portion of it that required a certain number of different types of farm animals in order to qualify as a farm. Those were seen as outdated, and really, if somebody could earn the income standard on 10 pigs, why would we tell them that they're not a farm unless they have 12, or it wasn't logical to set the standard in the definition of farm. It also allows for the definition of farm to be used universally throughout the ordinance and not just in the Ag Resource Protection Zoning District. Sorry, it's taken me a minute to get to that section. And then the standards involving income in order to build a home, you'll see are located in entirely in the use section of the ordinance, because you're not required to earn 30 or 40 or 50% of your household income to have a farm. It's only when you want to build a home accessory to that farm in the Ag Resource Protection District. You could certainly farm residential land without meeting that standard. So here we have the definition.
Are you able to make that a little bit larger? I would
Yep.
hazard a guess that the audience probably can't.
Oh, that's much worse there.
I think that's probably a little better.
So you can see any language that is underlined is new language, and language that is overstricken is deleted language. So if the change is approved, then the definition will read that a farm means any parcel of land which is used in the raising of agricultural products, livestock or poultry, or for dairying. Very short, straightforward, fairly similar to the state's definitions of farmland, and has nothing specific in it about whether or not the farm is located in the ag zone or residential zone, and doesn't set any standards related to that for whether or not a house could be built. Just purely defines a farm. As far as the package of changes, this works from a legal perspective as long as the standards are clear in the use section of the ordinance, and staff supports the amendment.
Is there any further staff report on this topic, on this issue?
Not specifically on the definitions, no.
Are there questions for the staff from board members? No questions? At this time, I'd seek a motion to open the public input section of the hearing.
So moved.
Motion on my left, is there a second?
Second.
Also on my left, all those in favor? We'd ask that you please come forward, state your name and address, and speak clearly into the mic, as the meetings are recorded for public record. Are there any members of the public that would like to come forward and speak on this topic?
Jim Pross, Hersey Hill Road, Auburn. I'm here tonight mostly to speak about the overlay district aspects as counsel for the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission. But I do just want to, besides just introducing myself, briefly address this section in concurring with Corporation Counsel for the city, that performance standards really are better left to the different specifics of the zoning definitions, as opposed to being sort of in a broader definition for the term farm. And I think that approaching it this way is a much cleaner method of putting your ordinance together, so that there's some homogeny in how you have these standards interpreted. Performance standards really are better left to the specific sections of the zoning ordinance that define whether it's a use, a permitted use, or a special exception. And so this is a nice, clean way to approach it, and I just thought I'd weigh in on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public that would like to speak on this topic?
We're talking just about this definition right now, is that correct?
Just this definition, yep. I will suspend public hearing, just for the public input, just for a second to address that. We have 5 sections. We have definitions. The next will be on use regulations. The third will be on the dimensional regulations, and our 4th public hearing will be on the watershed overlay district. so that the members and the public understand sort of how we're breaking it up. But yes, this is specifically just for this language. Are there any other members of the public that wish to speak? Seeing none, I'll.
Move to close.
There's a motion on my left. Is there a second to close the public input section of the hearing? Second on my right. All those in favor? This one is, as we move forward, we said we're going to use these planning board objectives. The first thing to do is to determine which objectives align with these changes. I think that it does not speak specifically to any of the objectives in here, although it is related to Objective 1, reducing the 50% income, that it also does not promote residential use by itself. But the planning board may choose to look at the planning board objectives for this specific language, or we may look to say that we have a recommendation based on whether or not we believe this is a better way to write a definition. So I will leave it up to the board in terms of, as we go through the discussion, sort of identify your opinion on the language, and then also what findings the planning board you believe could use to justify your opinions. And when we're done, we'll develop a consensus and create a recommendation. So is there someone that would like to start this discussion?
I think it does a better job of crafting a definition that's clearer and in line with city council and others. I think it's appropriate. And I don't know if there's a specific standard that it aligns with or not. However, I think it does make sense.
It seems like a reasonable change.
I would agree. I think it seems like a reasonable change, and it brings this definition more aligned with the regular form of definitions within the ordinance, which I think is good, creates consistency.
Yep, works for me.
Makes a lot more sense, definitely.
Okay, well, this one might be the easiest one of the night then. It looks like most people are in agreement. I would be seeking a motion on a recommendation to the city council with including a finding as to why that recommendation is put forth. So is there anyone that would like to make a motion with regard to recommendation?
Make a recommendation that we send on to the city council our agreement with the definition of a farm as set out by the staff recommendation, given that it's a much simpler and more easily, what's the word I'm looking for? More easily integrated into the overall definition of the farm use.
Is there a second?
Second.
Is there discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Motion passes. Does staff feel that they have what they need from us in order to be able to write the recommendation and then the...
I do. I think there was discussion about whether or not it facilitated meeting any of your objectives. It wasn't part of the motion. It would be helpful to kind of go through those and decide if the board, kind of as a group, thinks it helps meet any of the objectives that you.
Yeah, I think that will come into play probably on the next ones.
Okay,
than it did on
that's
this one,
fine.
Yeah. Okay.
There could be some overall general recommendations about the package of changes as well.
Okay. Our next public hearing is to review amendments to Chapter 60, Section 60-145, Use Regulations in the Agriculture and Resource Protection District.
This is really I guess the meat of the proposed changes. It does two things. It changes first, the one-family detached dwellings, accessory to farming operations. It changes the income standard on lots greater than 10 acres so that they still have the ability to do, I cut that off. ability to apply at a staff level for permitting for a house accessory to a farm on lots greater than 10 acres, but it changes the income standard to what we had sort of generally discussed, to 30% of total annual household income, and introduces this new option of 30% of the Auburn's median household income. Currently, that amounts to a little over $14,000 at the 30% number, and that is a measure of gross farm income, not net profit on the farm. This draft is based on one that was originally presented by staff. Staff had recommended introducing the idea of median income to sort of equalize the playing field as far as how somebody with varying household incomes could become a farming family. Staff recommended the 40%. Through the discussion, we ended up with a draft in talking with the council at 30%, but the initial staff recommendation was 40. And then there was some question raised about in section B that you can see on the screen. What does substantially completed mean for farm buildings? And they wanted to add more specificity to that, and we ended up with 75% completed. We often assess how much structural damage there is to a building. We could use a similar standard to assess that 75% of a structure is completed in agricultural structure to show somebody's commitment to the farming operation before we issue a certificate of occupancy to the house.
And may I ask a question? It's my understanding that this appears here, and that this appears here because it was, this would have been in the definition as previously written if it followed the model that our current zoning uses, but it was decided it's much better to put this in the use section of the ordinance rather than the definition of farm. That's why this is here?
The 50% standard resided in the definition, but it's been moved here.
Okay.
And the proposal is to change it to the 30%. And the reason is that the definition of a farm could apply in other zoning districts, and the income standard is intended to apply in the ag district and not to somebody trying to farm in a residential zoning district.
Okay, thank you.
So that's the first part of the changes to the use standards in the ag zone would be that income change. The second part is this new category of potential farms with an accessory residence. And that would be farms on properties that are less than 10 acres. Currently, it is not allowable to build a residence on a property less than 10 acres in the ag zone, even if it's accessory to a farm. The council's goal was to allow some flexibility on those smaller lots if there was a proposal that seemed to be a true farm. And we created a special exception use that essentially mirrored the permitted use for larger farms over 10 acres, but added additional standards, including that the applicant needed to demonstrate compliance with a set of requirements in front of the agricultural committee that the planning board could use as part of making their decision. The first of those requirements, well, firstly, the income would be reduced to 30% as the larger farms would be, and the median income standard could be used. The part that the agricultural committee would look at would be determining whether or not the applicant has provided a farm business plan that appears to be feasible and, if implemented, would meet the definition of a farm. The parcel can reasonably accommodate the proposed farm. So what they're proposing is in line with the amount of land that they have and seems reasonably able to do that. The council wanted to add a standard that demonstrated some level of commitment to farming prior to the issuance of a building permit for a home. So this standard number 3 was modified a bit over time, but it was added for that reason. The applicant needs to demonstrate a commitment to the proposed farm use through compliance with the following requirement. They need to show that the parcel has contributed a gross income per year of at least $2,000 per year from the sales value of agricultural products as defined in Title VII, Maine Revised Statutes, Section 152, subsection 2. That is the state's current use tax program for farmland classification for reduced taxes. The goal wasn't to force them to participate in that, but the goal was to show that they would have met that standard for at least 2 out of the previous 5 calendar years to demonstrate a commitment to the agricultural use. And that requires that they had a gross income of over $2,000 per year from an agricultural use in at least 2 of the previous 5 years. That helps show that somebody has truly committed to the farm use before they're even eligible for a permit, that they've done that for a couple out of the last 5 years at a minimum. The committee would also need to determine that the proposed residence will be accessory to farming, and it's entirely prohibited for this exception in the Lake Auburn Watershed Overlay District. The additional standards that are part of the special exception for the smaller farms include that the parcel was existing as of January 1, 2018. That's to ensure that new lots created that are in violation of the 10-acre standard are not buildable, and that they contain more than 5 acres of land and otherwise meet the standards for the zoning district. And then E and F are existing standards in the ordinance that address when something happens that causes the discontinuance of the farm use that was required for the permitting of the house. It prohibits the discontinuance of the agricultural use and requires them to meet the standards that they showed on their original plans, and allows for enforcement if that doesn't happen. And then it provides for an option if there's a reason that the farm discontinued and it wasn't an intention to circumvent the requirements of the article. Nobody can farm forever. People are going to age out of their farm. If nothing else happens, that prevents them before that. So this provides an out that allows them to continue to live in the residence when the farm ceases.
This changes the use for that parcel, correct?
This changes the use.
Exception granted by permission of the planning board applies to the use on the parcel, not how the person is using the parcel.
Yes, it does. Yeah, that's correct. And
So if it were to change, it's changed in perpetuity. Like, it's no longer.
it would no longer be required to have a farm on it.
So then, so they could retire, sort of age out of farming, and when they go to sell it, the next person is not required to farm. Is that?
That's correct. It could be approved that way. Planning board could, place some condition on it, but it would be difficult to require that after the person who permitted it was deceased. But I suppose you could condition something on that, deceased or unable to farm and sold for other reasons possibly.
Okay.
But it does allow it to transition to a non-farm residence with planning board approval after showing that it wasn't their intent to circumvent the ordinance. And that's consistent with what is in the current ordinance.
How many times has that happened? Do we know?
I don't know of it happening. I think there may be one or two that will come to you in the next decade or so, but I don't know that it's ever happened. I'm not aware of one. You had asked for some information on those types of questions. We would really have to, beyond the last 15 years, we would have to go through file by file for the houses and see if there was one of those that was approved that way.
Okay. Oh, so the board is aware, Mr. Cousins is referring to a question that I asked of staff, specifically about how many houses have been built in the ag zone since the adoption of the current ordinance? Which houses are still required to meet the 50%? Which properties are still required to meet the 50% rule? Which properties have been granted an exception by the planning board and no longer are required to meet the 50% rule? And how does staff track that and enforce that? So that's what Mr. Cousins was just referring to.
So, sorry, what was the answer to how many houses were actually built?
So there, in looking at the data, there were 54 of the 182 approximate houses in the ag zone were built after 1960. And after the, at the time it was called the Farm and Forest Zone, but it became the Agriculture and Resource Protection Zone. The exact circumstances for each of those parcels is not cataloged in a single database anywhere, but we have fairly reliable property files on each parcel in order to go through and tell you exactly how many were rebuilt because they were damaged by fire, or torn down and rebuilt, or torn down with planning board approval and rebuilt, or that were proposed as new homes accessory to agriculture. I could tell you the last 15 years, but we would need to go through all 54 of those property files, which we do from time to time when a question is raised for individual parcels. But that will take more time than we had before tonight's meeting to go through and do a comprehensive review. But I would suggest that be a part of the work with the Ag Committee.
Right, so essentially of that 54, some of those are rebuilds of property that was burned down or taken down. I can think of at least one where there were two houses and they were removed and replaced with a single one, so that would be counted in that 54. So we don't know how many right now were built under the 50% rule.
Yep.
That were beholden to the 50%.
Only
So that was,
two in the last 15
right,
years.
so that was sort of my questioning, like, okay,
obligated.
as we move
And,
forward.
As a
that look
follow-up,
like?
just so I correctly understand how staff is administratively applying the 50% rule, once the building permit is issued and the residence is built, nobody continues to go out there and verify, or is there any follow-up documentation required?
So we make sure that the farm buildings that are proposed as part of the farm plan are substantially complete before they receive a certificate of occupancy. And we do scrutinize the applications to make sure that in looking at it, we believe and we think we could defend the decision to issue a permit based on the information that's provided, that they will meet the income standard. Once they receive their certificate of occupancy, there is no defined time period where we go back and look at income. We typically will only look at income after that if it looks like the farm activity has changed or been reduced to something less than what was part of the proposal, or if we receive a complaint that that's happened from one of the neighbors. And we do, on the two that we've approved in the last 15 years, we have neighbors that watch very closely and are willing to call the city if it looks like something is not being done the way that it was proposed. I presume that any of them that were permitted before that, the case would be similar, but we haven't gone back to look at any that were permitted prior to 15 years ago recently.
And does the city take any kind of disciplinary or administrative action against these people that are no longer farming?
So there's a few different types of violations that have occurred. I have not found a farm dwelling that was permitted as a farm dwelling that has dropped below the income standard. I haven't encountered that in the time that I've been here. What we have encountered is a building that was permitted as something else permitted as a barn, that a neighbor calls and says, this barn that you guys permitted really looks like a house. And we went out there, and sure enough, it's a barn on the building permit, but it has windows and doors and a very nice fireplace and a bathtub and things that forced us to conclude that this is actually going to be a residence and it's not a barn. We issue a stop work order. Currently, that person has stopped all work on the house. It's been that way for a couple of years. It's not occupiable. It's not finished. They had chickens in there last I knew. It's not a residence, but they are in violation if they continue building it as a residence. So in that sense, yes, we've done enforcement. I just haven't encountered one that proposed that they were going to meet the income standard and then didn't. It's more been they proposed a
I see.
barn and built a house.
Sound like some very well cared for chickens.
It was the nicest chicken coop I've ever seen, but we do have a couple, and I think after, we've been hesitant during this discussion, the public discussion with the council and the planning board, to do income reviews on any of the ones that were permitted during the last 15 years, because we suspect that there's a chance that the standard may change, and if the person met 30 and didn't meet 50, do we really want to start an enforcement action right now? We have received some concerns about one of them, and we intend to follow up once we know where the standards are settling.
Could we go to the prior page? I'm confused by the suggested changes. It seems like there's two different income standards now being applied, because there's changing the 50% to 30%, as well as including this notion of Auburn's median income level. But then down below in that yellow block, there's this thing about the $2,000 in sales.
So
How does that?
it is two different standards, but the distinction is that the person needs to, at the point that they're applying for a house permit, they need to commit to meeting and demonstrate a farm plan that seems logical that they will meet the 30% of their household income or 30% of the median income for the future. In order to apply for the house permit, they also need to show that for at least 2 out of the last 5 years that they've already met this lower standard. The goal of $2,000 sales, the goal of it was to show some level of commitment for a period of time. There's no magic to the 2 years, but that they have been earning an income off the land, even if it's not the full standard, for 2 years before they can even approach the Ag Committee for a permit and the Planning Board for a permit to build a house.
So
So I
letter
could-
C lays out a potential alternate path to getting the building permit for the residents? Is that what you're saying?
No, it's in addition to, their plan, before that standard was in there, and I think the concern that drove putting that standard in there was that I could come up with a really nice farm plan and show up on day one, apply for a permit, and build a house and never build the farm. And especially, I would be in violation and I'd be subject to enforcement, but especially on these smaller lots. And last night, we heard some concerns from 1 or 2 counselors that they would like a similar standard to apply to the larger lots too. We just haven't been directed to make that change. This would require that I can't just come in with a really nice looking farm plan and apply for a building permit. I would also have to show you that for at least 2 out of the past 5 years, which is the way the state tax program measures it, I have already earned at least $2,000 from farming that land. It would be a deterrent from somebody that really has no interest in farming. They would actually have to demonstrate a commitment to that lower standard, $2,000 in revenue, for 2 years in order to apply for a permit.
I'm going to ask some basic questions because I'm actually really confused. The 50% income rule, as currently applied by the city, is that applied to business plans or the actual income of a private enterprise?
So it can be applied to a business plan. So somebody can come in with their business plan, and we have to ensure that the structures that will support the agricultural use are substantially complete before we can issue a certificate of occupancy for the residents. But they don't have to have an existing farming operation to apply for the permit.
So I could make a business plan to grow thoroughbred racehorses, and I can build a little barn and say I'm gonna grow 2 a year, and I can show I'm gonna make a bunch of money on paper doing that, and then you're gonna give me my building permit?
We're going to look at your plan, whatever it says, and we're going to talk to people, if we need to, that are familiar with that industry, and see if it seems logical. And we're going to make a decision to either issue or not issue based on all the information that we have. And we're going to make sure that whether we're deciding to approve it or not approve it, that the information that we're able to pull from your application and potentially from experts in that industry is we're going to decide in the way that we think we would prevail if we were in front of a Board of Appeals. So if you said, I'm going to grow 2 racehorses a year, but my racehorses are worth a lot of money, and I'm going to make more than half of my household income, my guess is we'd talk to people in the industry, and they would say that John Guy doesn't really know anything about horses. He hasn't shown that they're worth that much, and that's probably not going to happen, you know.
So it sounds like, yes, only the business plan is required. However, given that they're also required to build out 75% of the infrastructure base of
Yep.
the farm, therefore this works.
Yep. But it's still, you run the risk of the person not following through long-term with the proposed ag use.
Okay, and so, so thank you for explaining to me all that. And so can you just explain again? So C is, it's not, you're saying it's in addition to, so how does this help the inclusion of letter C?
So the 2 years in $2,000 income, or?
Yes, all that.
So
How
the
does that
whole
help us?
section C adds a step where the person has to go to an ag committee, and the goal is to have people that are familiar with agriculture on that committee that are determining whether or not they meet those standards. The $2,000 in sales from that parcel for at least 2 of the last 5 calendar years, that's really, I think, intended to, so that you can't just go buy a piece of land in the ag zone in less than 10 acres and on day one come in and apply for a permit. You need to demonstrate that you've already earned an agricultural income, which is going to take a substantial effort on your part for 2 years before you can even apply for approval with the ag committee and with the planning board. That standard doesn't exist for the larger than 10-acre farms, but it's proposed for the small ones.
At risk of oversimplification, is it fair to characterize C3 as a sort of form of pre-qualification?
Yeah, I would say that. It's putting in a substantial effort to earn a couple $1,000s per year for a 2-year period, so you can't just rush in and try to circumvent the ordinance.
And it's a pre-qualification that will apply only to individuals seeking a special exception on a lot greater than 5 but less than 10 acres, but this does not apply to individuals who are building but this section right here does not apply to individuals seeking to build a residence on a parcel that is 10 acres or larger.
Correct. That, in the current draft, that's absolutely correct. There was some discussion last night by 1 or 2 councilors about having a standard like this, but it's not in the current draft for the larger lots.
In a previous draft, was it written that it needed to, that people who were interested in a permit for building needed to be using the land for the 2 years preceding the application? I feel like in a previous draft, that was how I read it.
Yeah,
And that to me, made a lot of sense, but 2 out of the preceding 5 years, to me, does not necessarily show that there's an intent to farm or a current farming enterprise.
So a previous draft said that they needed to demonstrate compliance with the state farmland tax program, which is this Title VII Maine Revised Statute, Section 152. Our attorney was concerned that we couldn't force somebody to participate in that tax program, and she thought it was better to say whatever piece of that the council was trying to get at to hold somebody to, we should just state that here and not just reference that they have to demonstrate compliance with the tax program for 2 years. This requires them to do it for 2 years and to meet the 2,000 income standard. But the state program allows for 2 out of the last 5 years. It could either be the preceding 2 years, or it could be, there could have been a year where the farmer had a problem with blight or something on their crop and they didn't earn for some of those years.
When I read this language, it looks to me that we're asking them to meet the definition but not require them to be enrolled.
Correct. Yep.
So I think that we should look at the 2 out of 5 years. I think it would be important. I understand when blight happens or there's crop failure, but I do think that you could farm for 2 years, do nothing for 3, and still be eligible to apply for a permit. And I don't think that meets what we're trying to accomplish.
Yep. No, and I think there are other standards here that I would hope the Ag Committee and the Planning Board could sort of work through those issues and see if they are a legitimate farm or not. But that's absolutely correct. It could have been 2 years, 3 years ago, the previous 2 years they met it, and they could meet that number 3 standard out of it.
I would tend to agree. It seems highly unlikely that someone would derive a gross income of $2,000 per year for 2 years, walk away from the land for 3 years, and then somehow be able to derive $14,098 from it. It seems sort of like quite a jump, but.
And additionally, in this, what is it, C3, we're talking about gross income. So I'm assuming that that is sales. Yes, it says sales value. All you got to do is grow $2,000 worth of whatever, and you're there. I think that my understanding of this income standard throughout my personal interaction with this issue has always been that that's the net coming off the enterprise, because that's your income figure that you put on your taxes. So I just want to clarify, when we talk about 30% and 14,000, we are talking about net income to the family, therefore net profit coming off the farming.
We're talking about gross in the current draft, but I think.
So that's a change, correct, from the status quo?
No.
It is not.
It has not been, no. But obviously it's a much lower number than the 50% has been, especially if the family has a higher off-farm income. But that's certainly within the purview of the board to recommend using different measurement than, gross versus net or.
Yeah,
I have this sense that this has been fundamentally confused throughout all of the discourse in this hall. When I think about the way that the city council talks about it, I think that they're thinking about net income. So I don't know if I'm just mistaken. I won't continue to talk about it, but there is a serious issue if we're confusing the net income to the farming family with the gross sales of the farm enterprise.
Very, very different measurement, and we've intentionally made it very clear gross based on our workshops with the city council.
So I have a question about the gross in that 3C section, or C3, sorry. That includes whatever you grow and eat, so I could have a big garden and feed my family, and that that counts as gross income?
So under the
Like subsistence.
Under the state program, I believe that you can calculate some value from products that are consumed on the premises to meet the $2,000 standard. We have people in the audience that would be even more familiar with that than
Yep.
I am, but
So
my
would-
understanding is you can.
Would that be not for
under the
Auburn?
30% standard.
Okay.
That has to be income, but the state program allows for stuff that you gave away or a value to be assigned to that.
Are there further questions for staff from members? Are there further questions for staff?
Actually, I do have one more question. The January 1st of 2018 date, what is the origin of that?
It was picked out of the air to try to set a date that was before these discussions were kind of at their final stages, just so that somebody couldn't have seen the council discussing these proposals and created a lot and then somehow benefit from it. It's not, the exact date is not important. It's just that they wanted a date set that was before the current round of discussion, so nobody could benefit from violating the ordinance by creating one recently.
Wouldn't it then have to precede the current council? If they're,
They could set yesterday's date if they wanted, but the January 1, 2018 was what came out of the workshops.
I would keep that in mind as part of a recommendation as
Yeah.
we move forward.
The Crossroads study certainly started before that.
right.
Yeah,
It could be
We
2016.
may want to talk about preceding the original Crossroads study in and of itself, yeah. Any other questions from the board? Seeing no more questions from the board, I'll seek a motion to open the public input section of the hearing.
So moved.
Second.
Motion to my left, second to my right. All those in favor? If you'd like to speak to the topic, please come forward. Clearly speak your name and address into the mic.
Ray, Soapers Mill Road. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for this process. This is so much better than the process last night. Two of you are going to be counselors in a week or so. Please think about that, because this is perfect. With regard to this here, this is meant to mimic the state program, correct?
Yeah, for the 2-year period.
And when Stephanie Gilbert came down and talked to us, she said that that $2,000 figure is technically true, but they're thinking of updating it to $7,000 or so. So my question is, can you put something in here that reflects the state program and not just the $2,000? Because I know the council a number of years ago did the same thing for fees. Instead of listing every fee they said, see this table. The ordinance then just referenced a table. So can you just reference the state program and use the current value? That's just a question.
I think you could. We don't have the language in front of us tonight, but if that was part of a recommendation, it could be crafted that way.
And then another question I have, it says the parcel must contribute to a gross income. So I'm wondering, this won't be applicable, but my wife and I live on one parcel of land that we have, and she really wants a house on the other parcel of land we have, and they're not connected. And we do raise a lot more than that at our current farm. Do we then have to go to the new place and raise stuff there for 2 years before we can move our farm over there?
In the ag zone, the way that it's written, and there's no proposal to change this right now, we can look at parcels across the street as contiguous. So I don't know if that would help or not.
Doesn't help us, but
We'd have to look at your situation.
I'm not looking for me specifically, but I know there's people doing farming in other areas of Auburn that are looking to grow. and they are currently making this measure that you've put up there, but if then you inhibit them from just moving lock, stock, and barrel to a new place. So I'm just wondering if it has to be the parcel or if it's just farming in general, because we're really concerned with is people farming, correct?
Well, I guess my assumption would be that they'd be moving to a parcel at least the size that they're already on. So this applies right now only to those parcels that are
Between 5 and 10
between
acres.
5 and 10.
Right. But they could move to one of those. They're currently on 3 acres, the people that I know specifically. So they could move to a 7 or 8 or 9 acre farm, a parcel of land, and make that their farm. So again, there's just sticky points, and just wondering about them. But again, thank you for the process.
Thank you. Is there anyone else from the public that would like to speak on this topic?
So I have several things I'd like to talk about. As Joe said, I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight, and for us to have a public hearing, although I do have an issue with it, that the public was not properly notified about this, as is the case with many of these meetings. And also, there are there's a incorrect date on one of the forms in here. I printed that. The December 9th meeting isn't even on the calendar. It's down there as the 16th. Just lots of things that confuse and misinform the public. And I think we need to fix that.
Before you begin, can I ask you, only because is
Michelle Malorano, Trap Road, sorry.
Oh, actually, totally different thing, but thank you for stating your name. It's generally the policy of the board to not accept new materials, although as I'm looking at this appears not to be new materials so much as it is an outline of your discussion. So for the record, can you please just state on record what it is that you've handed to us? So that way no one at home
I do have that down here.
So that no one at home thinks that we have some sort of
Sure, yeah, I'll get to that. That's the third bullet on here. I will get to it, absolutely. So the first thing on here, I just want to talk about some of the language in here. It has changed multiple times, rapid fire, so that none of us, even who are familiar with some of this language, can really keep up with it adequately. Nowhere in the language is there any protection against a landowner building a road in order to increase their road frontage, thereby exponentially increasing the number of 10-acre lots that can be subdivided. Nowhere in the language is there any protection against a landowner or anyone else, for that matter, requesting the extension of or the reinstatement of dead-end roads that have not officially been discontinued by the city. Browns Crossing Road, Jordan School Road, Jake's Road, Elmwood Road. I think there are others. Those are the ones I'm familiar with. I feel those things must be included in this language in order to prevent these large tracts of land from becoming subdivided in that nature. The one right behind me can become a nice little loop to create about 80 lots, 10 acres each, especially with that person's new 58-acre acquisition. The document that I just handed out to everyone is just my attempt to make a reminder about the opposition versus the support for these changes, and the overwhelming majority in opposition of these changes. The first page shows a large number of professional entities, these aren't individuals, who are in opposition of the proposed changes. The $40,000 to $50,000 independent review, the Conservation Commission, Planning Board has spoken against it, Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission, Legal Office of Bernstein Shur. Good, I don't need to read it all, you guys have it. Multiple entities that have issued professional statements in opposition of this due to natural resource.
Fairness, the planning board hasn't, this is the first time we looked at this language, so I'm sort of perturbed that we've been included on this list, which makes me question.
This is a compilation of over the process.
Which makes me question, but
over the process. It's my turn to talk, though. If you let me talk, it's over the process. You folks have spoken against the process. Over the course of that process, this is the list of people who have spoken in support of it, okay? And it's people, it's individuals. There is no professional entity on this list regarding resource protection or watershed protection or open space or recreation or anything. These are individuals. And I'm having great difficulty understanding why this group of people or entities is trumping this group. I don't understand that. In addition, also listed on here is that in any of these opportunities where the public has had a chance to speak, 80 to 100% of the people who stand up and speak are doing so in opposition of these changes. I think there needs to be some accountability in terms of how this has been handled. It's been handled in a very intimidating and bullying manner. Not by you folks, but there needs to be some accountability, and I haven't seen it yet. I've had a couple of conversations with folks, even including the city manager today, and have asked why that accountability hasn't happened. That's all I'm going to say about that for now. Maybe I'll speak a little bit more about that in one of the next couple of readings when public
Do you have
can
any
speak.
comments specific to this section that we're reviewing?
Yeah,
that you
those
would
are
like
the
to
first
share?
three. Those are the first three. That there's no language in there that protects somebody from building a road and exponentially increasing their road frontage, or to petition the city to reinstate roads that have not been officially discontinued, also thereby exponentially increasing their road frontage and their ability to subdivide even further, even if it's just the 10-acre lots. Thank you.
Kathy Shaw, Valley View Farm, Soapers Mill Road. Also, I want to thank you because I feel that you folks are listening and asking pertinent questions and giving the limited members of our public the opportunity to truly ask questions that are not necessarily, I don't feel quite as intimidated. And that's a big step for me because that doesn't happen very often. A couple of things for me. We live in an area of Auburn that is equally as important as the watershed overlay. Our farmland is gone. Our prime farmland has been gobbled up by the airport, the malls. It's gone. We have maybe 1,000 acres of that prime farmland left. What I farm is rocky, difficult to work soil, which is the majority of our properties out in the South Auburn area. That's a resource that is difficult to manage. You can't really grow a lot on it without a certain amount of huge effort. That being said, I think it's equally important for clean air and water, forestry, farm animal, our wildlife, as the water, Lake Auburn overlay. I think that should be given just as much credibility. There are large parcels of undeveloped land in East Auburn. No roads. I would hate to see those broken up into 10-acre lots. Question for Eric. Since this has all started to be discussed, Eric, have there been more under 10-acre lots created that you are aware of? So why can't we back that January 1st, 2018 date up to when we first started talking about this with the Crossroads study? If it was a random date, back it up. I don't know if there's been others created. I don't know. But why not take that as a random date as well? I think we have, through good intentions, made this new proposal very, very weighty and difficult to understand. And I don't know who will simplify that, if it can be simplified, and maybe it can't anymore. But I do appreciate the amount of effort and attention that you guys are putting into this, and thank you for letting me speak this evening.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public that wish to speak on this topic?
Ask a question. I just got flustered and off of my game, so it's just a question about something definitely.
Is it a question for staff?
It's a question for everybody. It's a kind of an awareness thing.
Yeah, please come forward and act as though you're coming back to the mic. Please state your name and address.
Yeah, Michelle Melarano, Trap Road. So you were talking about potential of penalizing someone who stops farming or retires or whatever. I know it's not well defined. But my question is, if a business in the commercial or industrial zone, if that business ceases to exist, do they get taxed higher? Do they get penalized for not having a business on their industrial property? No. So then why would farmers get taxed higher when they retire, or, they don't have a family moving in to take over the farm? Why are they getting penalized? Why are the farmers getting penalized?
This speaks specifically to the use, not the tax. That's something that the assessor would have to.
But it's the penalty. I don't care if it's a tax. I don't care if they're told to move off their property. I don't care if their house is torn down. It's a penalty for no longer doing what they were doing on their property. So,
I can answer this. Accessory residential uses are allowed in the industrial zone as accessory to owning the business. So you could be like a business owner that lives on your property. But if you cease the industrial use, then you have to cease the residential use. There's no mechanism to allow that person to stay at all for any reason.
So if somebody has I don't know, name a business, a mechanic, they're a mechanic.
Right, and they live upstairs.
And they become disabled because a car falls on them and breaks their back. So you're going to kick them out of their home?
If the shop ceases to be used as an industrial use, yeah, they're not allowed to.
Well, that answers a lot of questions for me.
So this is actually, I guess, a little nicer in it.
Is that accurate?
So, could I?
Yeah.
There are only two zones in the city that are that limit residential development to the extent that the industrial zone and the ag zone do. And the ag zone was often described by a former planner here as a natural resource-based industrial zoning district.
Okay.
There are only two zones in the city that do not allow residential uses. And the industrial zone allows a lot of uses that you wouldn't want to necessarily live next to. They're the loudest, or they have an odor, or they process chemicals that are flammable or dangerous. The ag zone allows for gravel mining, timber harvesting, spreading manure, and things that people don't necessarily like to live next to, or they complain about the impacts of. But those are our only two zoning districts where residential uses are only allowed to serve the commercial use.
Okay.
Other zoning districts would allow, general business, for example, would allow residential or commercial or a combination, and each one could exist independent of the other.
Okay, and so how many times has that happened? When someone has had to close their business due to whatever reason, through no fault of their own, because I know we've used that language in here, and they've been forced to leave their property?
I don't know off the top of my head. We'd have to look at industrial files and ag files.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other members of the public that wish to speak on this topic?
Leroy Walker, 41 Broad Street, Auburn. I just want to mention one thing. When this whole thing started, where it really started was when a person was pretty much forced out of their home that owned property on the Pownell Road in Auburn. This is where it first started. And they reached out, this person reached out to every counselor that we had here at the time and said, they're stealing my home. I've given them this, I've done that. True or not, I don't know. But it was under 9 acres or just under 10. So this council that was in place said they were going to try to do everything they could do to help this person. We went to Eric Cousins' office and said, why can't we give him a variance? We don't do that in the city of Auburn. Why can't the planning board say, give him a variance? We don't do that in the city of Auburn. I said, well, what the hell do we do in the city of Auburn? This lady bought a home thinking that she could live in it, and she can't live in it because she can't get an occupancy permit to live in it. She can't fix it, she can't raise animals, she can't drive a fence post, she can't do anything. So what does she do? Sells it to somebody else or whatever her deal was, but cried the whole time because that was her home and that was her dream. All we had to do, so we wouldn't be here, sitting here tonight, arguing about who does what, who don't do what, who shouldn't own it, who should be the one that gets penalized, who shouldn't be penalized, was had a variance for people that own land under 10 acres. That's all we had to fix in the city of Auburn, and we wouldn't be worried about somebody taking 100 acres, turning it into 10 acres, which they could have done. It's in the rules, they could have done that. Can they extend a road? Yeah, with a hell of a lot of work going through you, going through them, going through the city of Auburn. But we couldn't fix it by doing a lousy little thing, give a variance to somebody that has a beautiful home because they didn't own quite 10 acres plus. We drove them out of their home. The other person's living there. I don't know how it happened, but they're raising horses, they're living, they're happy as hell. But this poor lady has not been happy from the day she had to sell her home and move out. Simple. Really simple, but here we are 2 years later or more. Second one, Mr. Herrick had a place that he was either inherited, bought, paid for. We did the same thing there. A lousy variance would have fixed his whole problem. He wouldn't have argued for a year. He sat on the council. We couldn't budge the city. We couldn't budge nobody. A very simple fix. I'm telling you, simple. All you had to do was say to their department, we will do variances in this city. Under 10 acres, we will do it. And we'll change that wherever it fits into your paperwork here. We never did it. It's mind-boggling how many people we have to upset in this city to get them to come here in front of you, in front of the council, and argue about everything that people are only trying to make it so people can do something to live and do it honestly. I moved in 1966 on the Jordan School Road, remodeled my home bigger than the home that I moved into. I don't know how I got the variance to do it, but I wasn't a counselor, I wasn't a cop, I wasn't a lawyer. I just said, I live in this house, it's 33 by 30, I want an addition, I got a permit, I built it. No one's tried to kick me out yet, I haven't grown a tomato on that land. So I don't know, I don't live there anymore, only Beverly does, so if they're gonna kick anyone else, they're gonna have to kick her out, so that might be a little bit of a chore to get done. There's other people that live up the road, they live in little houses that have been there for years, remodeled them. They did their little thing too. They haven't bothered a soul. Their house is a little bigger. They put in a septic tank, drilled a well. They don't live far from Kathy and Joe. They don't go up there and bother them. They haven't taken any land from them. They haven't changed the road, put a lot of black tire marks on it, but that's the only thing they do. It's just simple. I've asked Eric why we couldn't do it, and it's pretty much the same thing. We don't do it in the city of Auburn. There are many people there, places that do it, and I don't understand why we've gone through this exercise for 2 years, driving everybody nuts, and driving you nuts now to bring it back to us to drive us more nuts. That's where it's going, up and down, over the mountain.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else from the public that wishes to speak on this topic? Seeing none, I'll seek a motion to close the public input section of the hearing.
So moved.
Motion on my right. Seconded on my left. All those in favor? I would make a suggestion to the board as we move through this and we apply our planning board objectives. I think it might be prudent to split this into two recommendations. The first recommendation being for section 60-145 use regulations A1, which is the single-family detached dwelling in which we have at least 30% of the total annual household income of the farm occupants living in the farm residence will be derived from farm uses, or the gross farm income of the farm occupants living in the farm residence is equal to or greater than 30% of Auburn's median household income according to the most recent census data. Are there any objections to taking this in, instead of writing one recommendation for the entire thing, writing a recommendation regarding this and then writing a recommendation regarding the special exception? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it makes sense to do it like that. They're kind of definitely different uses. There are different repercussions for each part, you know?
Any other discussion on that topic? Let me ask a more pointed question. Is there anyone opposed to doing that?
No.
No.
Okay.
Are you including the 75%? The next one down?
Yes, I think we should,
Those two together.
right, make a recommendation on the permitted uses section and then make a recommendation on the special exception uses.
Got it.
Again, so as we read that, at least 30% of the total annual household income of the farm occupants living in the farm residence will be derived from farm uses, or the gross farm income of the farm occupants living in the farm residence is equal to or greater than 30% of Auburn's median household income. According to the most recent census data, we are looking at the following objectives. Does this represent a reduction in the 50% income rule? Does it seek to limit or not promote residential uses and require that residential uses remain accessory to agriculture? Does it neither favor small-scale nor large-scale agriculture? And possibly 5, does it take into account the impact that the heavily forested area within the ag zone might have on future agricultural uses? So those were the objectives. So I think, so I've read the language again, read the objectives. At this point, we need to have discussion with regard to the specific objectives and whether the language meets those objectives or not.
I think this change does meet our first objective. It certainly does reduce the 50% rule. My concern or my question is that I think we don't have enough information. There's been no financial modeling to show whether or not a reduction from 50% to 30% would impact forestry or other conservation efforts. And considering that the language that we've been using has been that it's a choice to farm, it's a lifestyle choice, does that mean that this change would then favor only small agricultural pursuits and not larger ones? I think there's just not enough data. This is a very specific and pointed question. These standards are applied to a very loose and, I don't want to say non-specific, 30% is very specific, but it's been polled without having data to back it up.
So is it fair to say that your stance is that it does represent a reduction in 50% income? How about number 2 with regard to requiring that it remain that residents remain an accessory use to agriculture?
I think that it does meet the standard. Number 2, it does not promote residential use that is not accessory to farming, because it still would have to be tied to farm income.
And that because the 30% was not tied to a specific metric of research, that you believe we don't have enough information to speak to its impact to number 3, 4, and 5?
Correct.
Other discussion?
I would say that the reduction to 30% does meet the first goal, although I, again, will state my opposition to percentage based off that, and that's basically just done off my research that I have done, that normally startup farms or smaller scale farms don't make a profit that would come close to that in their operations. And I, looking for a better way to do it, I can't think of one right offhand, but everything that I've seen so far said that 50% of the farms are basically just breaking even. They're not profiting from it. And you know as well as I do, a farmer can hide that. Oh, I've got $5,000, I'm going to buy a new truck or a new tractor. You're back down to zero again. But trying to impose a monetary standard on that almost rings true of saying, I'm going to tell you how you should farm, and you have to be profitable and you have to be successful. And I don't think that we do that with anything else in the city. I have a hard time applying it solely to farmers. It does meet some of the other standards. I think it would be an accessory to agriculture. If you're looking at having to farm, I think that might stop the sprawl. If people are understanding that it's a job, it is a lifestyle, it's not something that you're going to be able to play at per se, I think that would go to handling the sprawl. When it gets to the other two questions, large scale versus small scale, that's pretty rough. I mean, I've seen large scale operations that are not successful, and I've seen small scale operations that are extremely successful. So that's going to be a hard one to judge. And forestry, the first 2 years I may have a piece of forested property. My profit for the 2 years may be cutting down trees. That's agriculture. Technically you're harvesting a crop, so I could say that cutting down trees is my crop, and do that for a 2-year time span and meet the criteria.
Other discussion? Other comments?
I think I agree. It meets number 1. It is actually addressing that directly. I worry about the lack of data, just as Ms. Boss was worried. I have a concern about that. It's hard for me to assess, particularly number 5, but number 3 and 4 as well, without any knowledge of what the situation is for our current farms. So how much, we just don't have any data. I would love to see data on that. But.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, I'll speak to that because it's come up 3 times now. 3, 4, and 5 are somewhat speculative. And so it requires us to make a judgment call, and it might be prudent to include in the board's recommendation to the city council so far, and I'll echo that I do believe it meets 1 and 2. I would tend to agree with Mr. Carrier that it probably meets number 3, but I would cautiously also say that we don't have the data. We may want to think about a recommendation that states our belief that it meets the planning board objectives 1 and 2. However, there's going to need to be some sort of mechanism on the part of staff to track growth and development so that we can understand what the impact of such a change has been as we look forward. That's something that I asked staff, and it came up in the meeting today. Clearly that information is not readily available regarding the current zoning restrictions, but that as we move forward, in order to be able to answer questions like this for the planning board, part of our recommendation needs to be that council should be directing staff to be keeping track of growth and reporting back to council and the planning board so that we understand what's happening as we move forward, so that way we can understand whether or not this made those sorts of changes. And if additional amendments were to come to us in the future, we would be better positioned to understand what the impact of those potential changes might be.
And I'm also going to fall back to the Bates study. We're talking about the information that we've used in this process. In the Bates study, of the respondent farmers that did respond to it said that, and I'm going to quote a number here, that 95% of them don't make a majority of their income from farming, that they have another source. So that just adds to my disdain for the total of the 30% versus the 50.
But the biggest thing with the income part is that it's like the gross, not the net, though, right? So it should be a lot easier to gross 30% than it is to just net it, Like you were talking about hiding profit and all that. I mean, they don't necessarily have to profit 30% of their income, right? It's confusing, like John mentioned earlier, how it's worded.
Yeah, you have to ask.
Well, I think that this ties into the fact that there has been a collective understanding that we were talking about profits from the enterprise. I really believe that. And I think a lot of people get confused about the difference between revenue and profit. But as I reflect back on all the city council meetings I've been listening to, I think there must be confusion about that, and I'm concerned because this is absolutely fundamental to the ordinance. And it's a big difference. So I guess if staff, Mr. Cousins, is telling us that it's always actually been about gross income or revenue.
And we intentionally got very specific in the proposed language to make sure everybody's on the same page on that, but it has been measured against gross farming income against taxable income off farm in the past. And I was hoping I could show you the data that the council has seen, and I thought it was part of an earlier presentation for some of the board members that were here when Department of Ag was here to do a presentation on farm income, because the net farm income, average farm income for Androscoggin County is in the neighborhood of $14,000, which is in the same neighborhood as the 30% standard. But that's net, as you've pointed out. The proposed ordinance is gross. But there is some data behind that in choosing a number, but it's not there's no exact magic number. Staff suggested 40. The council draft arrived at 30, and we're still trying to figure out if there's consensus around that.
Do we know if there's like an average gross income? Do we have any numbers on that?
We had gross as part of that. I don't recall what the numbers were, and I'm not having much luck getting the data off of this portal right now.
So I think that there's a lot of broad support for reducing this income standard, and that's why it's one of the recommendations of the planning board, correct? The process for determining how we were going to get to what we would reduce it to has not been good. It's been pretty dysfunctional. And as a result, we don't know whether this is enough or not enough to meet supposed goals. So it could make, if there's broad support to reduce it and 30% is the number that's on the table, that's fine. But it doesn't, the 30%, so this 14,000, if that's actually the average of net, then that's a completely different concept than gross sales. So there's no underlying logic.
Well, I think sort of to further confuse the issue is that we say at least 30% of the total annual household income. As someone who is married to an individual that is a small business owner, the income that is reported is not the same as our household income does not include her gross income in her business. There's two different things written here as well. One of these is really your household income which is sort of, that's what you're going to get taxed on, right? And then conversely, later on, we have gross profit, but you're not going to be taxed on your gross profit because that doesn't represent the income. It's reasonable, it is reasonable for the planning board to say to you, we're applying the planning board objectives, but if we feel that there's incongruence in the language, it's okay for the planning board to say that the language should be developed to either reflect gross throughout
Yeah, well,
or
it's
net
thrown me
throughout.
for a big loop to learn tonight in December, when I've been following this issue since April, that these concepts are getting conflated in the discourse. So it's a much bigger, it's a bigger impact to say, well, it's only 14, you only need to gross sales $14,000. That's completely different than net profit $14,000. So, I'll stop talking about it.
Well, so in order for us to make a recommendation, there needs to be a position taken. So do you have a specific position on that, or is your position simply that you think it should be clarified? Do you have a position as to which one should be used?
My personal position is everybody agrees that the income standard should in fact be lowered. So, well, this lowers it. But this isn't, I guess this is some kind of a political compromise, but there's not much thinking or logic behind this number. And on top of that, I think the whole process has been very confused. So, I think that the profit versus sales really needs to be clarified, and it would help if we had some kind of an understanding of, for the actual businesses, farm businesses that are set up in Auburn, like what do these numbers mean for them? That's simple information to get. I mean, you're talking about financial modeling or data, but what about just like, why can't we go out and talk to the farmers? I guess I'm frustrated with the process.
So,
Is there a specific recommendation that you would tie to that frustration?
I would recommend that we observe that, yes, this reduces the income requirement, but why hasn't better legwork been done to get it? Why don't we have better information, understanding of what we're talking about at this point?
So I want to come back to something actually you just said as you reread that language, Mr. Sear, and that is that item A itself is actually inconsistently worded. And any recommendation we have has to fix that issue. I have no opinion on, because I don't have any data, I have no opinion on whether we're dealing with income or gross household income or gross farm income. I don't even know which one to choose because I don't have any data to look at, but we can't have those two things in the same, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I agree. I think part of a recommendation needs to be to create a consistency regarding household income and the farm income, defining whether they are both gross or both net. And that if the council finds that they believe gross is the appropriate measure, then by all means use gross in both the farm income and the household income. And if the council finds that net should be used, then they should use net as the farm income and the household income as well. But it should be quite clear.
Can our recommendation to council say that we recommend that they compare the two options, but take into consideration what actual revenue or gross, what actually is happening with Auburn farms currently, and take that into consideration when we're making our decision? Because I think one of the issues that we're facing is that we're using the term modernize, and that doesn't mean anything. We have to say what our goals are. Are we trying to reduce the income threshold so that we can support our current farmers? Are we trying to support a different set of farmers? We're not clear. So we need to take that into consideration.
Well, I think it's certain that in our last set of recommendations, we had additional recommendations, and I think that it would be well within our purview to recommend that regardless of what happens moving forward, that this be revisited and be revisited within a specific time frame to to determine whether or not it's meeting specific goals. Unfortunately, the city council has not, as a whole, developed a comprehensive set of goals, so what they want to measure against, I don't know. But is there additional discussion?
If I
Yes.
could, just one comment. I think that the things that the board is talking about that you're concerned with are pieces of why the last recommendation suggested that before something's enacted, that it be reviewed by this new ag committee. We don't have data for farm income specific to Auburn. It doesn't exist. We have Androscoggin County. We've used that to look at average farm income, which was in the neighborhood of $14,000 or $15,000. The council, through the discussions, has decided to use gross through the workshops. I recognize those are different, but I think the goal has been to have some incremental change, that the 50% standard is too high to expect any new farms. We've seen very few new farms. 40% was recommended by staff. The discussion led to 30%, but there isn't magic to one, whether it's 33 or 35 or 40. There's no magic to that, but the lower it goes, the lesser of a restriction there is, and the less of a connection to farming that's required, and the higher, the more of the connection to farming that's required. An incremental approach is what we were trying to achieve, and there's been a lot of data related to income presented to this board, to the Ag Committee from 2 years ago, to the council, but the membership changes over time, and as membership changes, it's hard from a staff perspective, because I feel responsible for providing the data that you guys need and the council needs. As those boards change, it's hard to do the same thing over and over again to make sure the current people in those roles have all of that. So that's been a challenge.
So as we look at our role in this public hearing is to make a recommendation. I'm going to try to sum up those pieces that represent the greatest consensus amongst what I've heard. Okay, so if I leave something out, it's because I felt that it was maybe mentioned but was not mentioned by more than one, or didn't seem accepted by several. That the board finds that the 30% seems somewhat arbitrary, but that it does represent a reduction in the 50% income rule. It does promote residential use only as accessories to agriculture. The planning board feels more information would be required to make a better assessment as to whether or not the proposed language would prevent sprawl or growth, whether it would favor either small or large-scale agriculture, or whether it would have an impact on forestry. And further, that the board believes there needs to be some consistency in language to clearly define both household and farm income as either gross or net. Have I captured sort of what's been said? Okay. We can do two things. If you believe that I've captured that, what I just said is on the record, we can make a motion to that effect, what I just said, or you may choose to make a motion. You may choose to word your own motion, essentially. So, but I think at this point, we've discussed things. I think it's clear that there's some frustration, but that with regard to recommendation on this specific language, as a board, we're fairly clear at what consensus we reached. So I'm seeking a motion.
I would accept that as a motion and make a friendly amendment to say at the very end that we use any available data about Auburn-specific harms to inform decision-making.
I'll accept that. Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion? All those in favor? All those against? None being, motion passes. Eric, do you feel that that was clear enough, that the tape can be reviewed?
I think I have everything except for the part about the net versus gross. And I think I can get that from the tape, and I can share that with the board to make sure I've captured it accurately, and it'll be on YouTube for the whole world as well, so.
Excellent. Next, we would be looking at the special exception use. My assumption here is that all of our recommendations regarding the regular use would apply. However, we need to discuss the additional requirements. Am I erring in assuming that the board sort of has the same feeling about the 30% total income requirement section in the special exception as it did in the regular use? I would assume that it's...
I agree.
Okay. So specifically, we really need to focus on the applicant shall demonstrate compliance with the following requirements. Said compliance to be first reviewed by the Agricultural Committee for recommendations. 1, the applicant shall provide a farm business plan that appears feasible and, if implemented, will meet the definition of a farm. 2, the parcel can reasonably accommodate the proposed farm. 3, the applicant shall demonstrate a commitment to the proposed farm use through compliance with the following requirements. The parcel must contribute a gross income per year of at least $2,000 per year from the sales value of agricultural products as defined in Title VII MRSA Section 152, subsection 2, in 2 of the 5 calendar years preceding the date of the application for special exception use approval. Gross income includes the value of commodities produced for consumption by the farm household. 4, the proposed residence shall be accessory to farming. 5, the proposed residence shall not be located in the Lake Auburn Watershed Overlay District. These need to be renumbered. So this should really be a 6. The parcel was existing as of July 1st, 2018, and contains more than 5 acres of land area and otherwise meets the requirement of Chapter 60 zoning. What would be number 7? In no case shall any farm residence constructed under the provisions of this section after the effective date of the amended ordinance from which this section is derived continue to be occupied as a residence of the principal agricultural use. If the principal agricultural use has been abandoned or reduced in scope below the minimum requirements as shown on the plans and specifications presented to the municipal officer charged with enforcement. And finally, any residence constructed under this article shall not be converted to non-farm residential use except by permission of the planning board based upon a finding that the abandonment or reduction of such use resulted from causes beyond the control of the applicant and not from any intention to circumvent the requirements of this article. So E and F, which I guess would really be 7 and 8, are copy-pastes from requirements for the regular use, so that everyone understands why those are there. But
just a clarification, there are standards A through F that have to be met. C requires a recommendation from the Ag Committee. D, E, and F, I think are appropriately lettered and are not purview.
okay, I apologize. Yeah, I lost my...
But it's, as you're changing pages, it's
right,
hard
that's
to-
difficult. So
But that was the intent.
I understand. I apologize. Let the
The board
record
would still
show.
review those, but not the Ag Committee.
So I think it's clear that there are going to be some specific recommendations with regard to the language. But before we get to those specific recommendations, in looking at our planning board objectives, does this represent a reduction in the 50% income rule? Does it promote the residential use only as accessory to agriculture? Does it prevent sprawl or growth? Does it not favor either small-scale or large-scale agriculture? And does it address forestry? I think that in an effort to get to those comments that will be specific to specific language, our take on 3, 4, and 5 and the entirety of the special exception section will probably be similar to our take on the regular use, and that in general, this language does meet the planning board objective 1 and 2. Am I hearing any dissent on that?
I would agree that it meets 1, but I think for 2, as it's written, it could potentially promote residential use that's not accessory to farming, considering the 2 out of 5 calendar years language. And if we were to edit that to say the 2 years preceding application or the 2 out of 3 previous years, it would close that window, I believe.
So, is there anyone that disagrees with that point?
I agree, and I think we could additionally include Mr. Gray's suggestion that we just reference state law so that it updates automatically.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Is there, question for you,
Yeah.
is there a way that we can reference that as part of the monetary money earned is mirrors that of the state?
We can certainly do that, yep. Just look for, on Katie's part of that, either a decision of the board that it's 2 out of 3 or 2 proceeding, and then a motion that includes a recommendation that we reference to the state standard should that 2,000 change to something else within the state law.
How do we feel about the date? I think, did you just mention the date? I apologize.
No, I didn't, but I would like to talk about that.
It seemed you mentioned that earlier. I think it would be reasonable to just say that it needs to be a lot that predates the previous ad hoc.
Eric, do you know when the previous date was?
What is the date that would predate the ag study?
I mean,
The Crossroads study?
2015 certainly would, but I could get the exact date if we wanted to be exact.
We could certainly say to a date to precede the Crossroads study.
I would support that.
Okay.
And how long did that study take? I'm just thinking, do we want it to say the initiation of that study or the final presentation? I don't recall what the length was.
I think it was close to 18 months by the time we got done, but I guess one date that would be set in stone is when Mayor Labonte proposed the resolve and got the resolve approved that created the committee and established that study.
I think that would make sense
If that resolve
as a
would
date.
be a date certain that I could find.
I apologize.
The date of the resolve where Mayor Labonte created the ad hoc committee to do the Crossroads study would be a reasonable timeline.
Yep.
Are there other things that people felt needed to be included? Yeah, I guess I was asking, Mr. Carrier, we did open it up to public comment,
Scope.
but then we narrowed the scope. So seeing that I chose to break this into 2, I know we already had public input in this public hearing with regard to this language. However, if anyone is interested, I will ask the board to open up the public hearing again. Is anyone interested? Is there a motion
So
to
moved.
open?
Second.
All those in favor of opening additional public input section?
Thank you. Jim Pross, I'm here as counsel to the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission. The only real issue that I would like to discuss with regard to the special exception use is just point out that there is this carve-out that would protect Lake Auburn watershed, the watershed overlay district from, that's your sub 5 there. So that sort of keeps the special exception use out of the overlay district and does sort of double duty with the proposed language for amending the Lake Auburn watershed overlay district. So I know that's coming up, and I'll reserve the bulk of my comments for that, but we do support including that language. Obviously, if this doesn't pass, then the importance of having the language in the overlay in the Lake Auburn watershed overlay district ordinance is not really pertinent, but for ensuring the protection of the water supply, the public water supply, we are happy to see this in here. So just wanted to get that point across, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Since we've opened it up, is there anyone that would like to provide additional comments? Okay, seeing none, I'll accept a motion to close public
moved.
input. Motion, is there a second? Seconded on my left, all those in favor? Is there any additional input? Yep,
Sorry.
no, go for it.
And somebody had mentioned earlier about a review time for this.
Yeah, I would like to add that as a
Stipulation or an addition to that, that it be reviewed so that maybe we can start looking at our own data to do this.
yeah, when we reviewed the last language amendment that came before us on this, we had sort of our recommendations on specific sections of language, and then we had sort of overarching recommendations at the end, and I think that would be the appropriate place to put that, would be as sort of additional recommendations.
Okay.
If that makes sense. I am going to try to encapsulate this again, and again, if I am only human, so if you think I've made an error, please say something. That the planning board finds that the proposed section 60-144B use 18 under special exception, the proposed language does meet the planning board objective of reducing the 50% income, would better meet the planning board objective of promoting residential use only as accessory to agriculture if C3 were amended to say in the 2 years preceding the date of application rather than in the 2 of the 5 calendar years preceding the date of application. That further information would be needed to make a better recommendation with regard to whether or not this will promote additional growth or sprawl, whether or not it favors small-scale or large-scale agriculture, and impact it might have on forestry, and further, that C3 should be amended to remove the requirement of $2,000 per year and tie that specifically to the state standard outlined in Title VII MRSA Section 152. Additionally, that D should be amended from a date of January 1st, 2018 to the date of the proclamation forming the original ad hoc committee by Mayor Labonte. Did I sort of encapsulate everything we said there?
So 3 years instead of 5 years, referencing the statute directly instead of 2000, the date, it's those 3 things?
I wasn't 3 years, I think we said 2
Oh, 2 years.
years preceding the date of the application, not doing 2 of 5.
Okay, but it's those 3 items.
Do we feel, is there someone that feels comfortable putting that into a motion?
I move that we recommend to accept these changes with the additional suggestions to change the number of years to 2 from 5, and to change the reference of $2,000 sales to just reference the actual standard in the statute, and additionally to modify the date for the grandfathering from January 1st, 2018 to the date of former Mayor Levanti's actual order.
May I offer a friendly amendment?
Absolutely.
That the recommendation include the findings that we believe the proposed language does meet Planning Board Objective Number 2, that upon revision of the 2 of 5-year standard to a 2-year proceeding standard could better meet Planning Board Objective 2, and that the board feels they do not have enough substantial data to make reasonable recommendations with regard to Planning Board Objectives 3, 4, and 5.
I accept.
There's a motion on the board. Is there a second? Discussion? All those in favor? All those against? Motion on the recommendation carries unanimously.
Who was the second on that?
Mr. Carrier. I know, I apologize. Jason's really good about saying who's made the motion and who's made the second. The next item on our agenda is a public hearing to discuss amendments to Section 60-146, Dimensional Regulations in the Agriculture and Resource Protection District. We will conduct this hearing the same way that we did the previous two.
The dimensional section, I think you guys have done some good work on the previous one, and dimensional section is a little simpler as far as a review, but it basically eliminates the prohibition of any structures on lots less than 10 acres to facilitate the previous section to allow for somebody on a lot that's between 5 and 10 acres to at least be able to apply for a farm residence as long as they meet those standards. It also does reference that the date, again, January 1, 2018, that I would suggest if you're changing it in one place, we also would want to change it here for consistency. And it references back to the only way that you can have a density that is less than 10 acres per household unit is to get approval pursuant to the use regulations in the previous section. So it depends substantially on the previous sections, but it does facilitate basically what you've talked about doing with the special exception in the previous section if the board's inclined to support that.
Are there any questions for staff from the board? Seeing none, I'll seek a motion to open it up to the public input section of the hearing. Motion by Mr. Carrier.
Second.
Second by Mr. Duvall. All right. All those in favor? All right, we'll open up. Again, if you'd like to come forward and speak specifically to this section, please state your name and address.
Kathy Shaw, Valley View Farm, Soapers Mill Road. This might not necessarily pertain exactly, but there's a couple questions in my mind that Michelle has raised, and I'm not sure if this is the proper time to address it. Michelle talked about discontinued or non-operable roads. What is the thought on that? Especially in our ag zone, we do have a half a dozen of these discontinued or non-functioning roads anymore. I think that's an important thing to be thinking about from the planning board aspect with this agricultural amendments. And then the second thing, it just came up just a moment ago. Will this require an additional first reading from the city council? Because this is all new. So would this not necessarily all have to go back for another first reading and then a second reading vote? Just my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other members from the public that wish to speak on this topic? Seeing none, I'll seek a motion to close the public input section of the hearing.
So moved.
Motion made by Mrs. Boss. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Engler. All those in favor?
Could we take a moment to get feedback from staff on the first reading, second reading? How will our recommendations be incorporated?
So, not knowing what the recommendations would be, we talked to our attorney who's been working with us through the council process, and she will provide an opinion based on whether or not the amendments are substantive, whether or not it will require a new first reading. I don't know tonight. My first impression, if the council says, thank you, planning board, for your recommendations, but we're not making all of these changes, then there may not be a first reading required. If they decide to incorporate these, I can't speak for Mary Costigan, who will give us that opinion, but I suspect that it may require a new first reading.
Yeah, that's important to remember that when we make these recommendations, the council is not required to implement them, right? We're just providing clarity, so.
I think that your recommendations are going to play a major part in how this council decides on these changes, though. So, we will have an answer for the council before they make a decision, but I can't say for sure tonight whether or not that'll require a new first reading.
And to the second question, I don't know if we want to start there, but concerning roads, it's come up a number of times. It came up last night in the city council meeting as well. And the conversation at that point was that it won't happen because the planning board uses the comprehensive plan as the basis for decision-making, and development is not allowed in the ag zone to creating roads in the ag zone is not allowed in the comprehensive plan. My concern there is that we've seen a number of projects come before us that are not in line with the comprehensive plan, or the current zoning is not in line with the comprehensive plan. So there's not a lot of assurance built into the process that just because it says it in the comprehensive plan that it won't happen. So I think it could be worth talking about what do we do about roads that are discontinued.
That's not exactly how I understood the discussion last night. It is entirely possible that somebody could propose a new road in the ag zone under the current standard and propose 10-acre, 250-foot frontage lots and build a new road and create lots. And I think that still is possible if the draft standards were implemented. Normally with a subdivision, if everything is working out to be consistent with the zoning and the comprehensive plan, they could go to the planning board will review that. If they got their approval, there's a presumption that if the road meets the construction standards after that, that it would be accepted as a city street. If there was one proposed in the ag zone, I think it would certainly prompt a discussion about that between the planning board and council. But right now, somebody could propose a new road or to reestablish an old road to build new frontage in the ag zone.
It's not a new, what makes it a new possibility is that we're changing the income requirements, but the possibility that someone takes their 1,000-acre lot and somehow creatively finds a way to split it into exactly 10 acres with an internal road, 10-acre lots or 100-acre lots or whatever, already exists. I think the concern is that by reducing the income requirement, someone might be more tempted to do that than they are now.
Yeah.
So
your concern is certainly warranted in it. I think that a reduction may increase the financial incentive to try to do that for somebody.
And so to me, the building of the internal road is less problematic given my experience on the board. Any internal roads are not going to be dead-ended roads, and you can't have a mile-long sort of cul-de-sac. Like, those things can't exist. What concerns me more, of course, they could do a through road. So a through road is something that the planning board would have a hard time saying that they don't want. What is a more concern to me is building long roads that are not currently maintained. And I think specifically of Woodbury Heights, which is built, part of that development is built along Woodbury Heights Road, Woodbury Road, which is, for all intents and purposes, a dirt road. There's asphalt there, but it's fallen apart to the point where it's essentially a dirt road. And so, I think the bigger concern would be to make sure that you're not having substantial development along a road that isn't currently maintained year-round by the city. So something to the effect of, like, you know, this parcel needs to be on a road that's plowed and maintained. Because we don't want to be, we don't want to all of a sudden have to plow another, 20 miles of road that are dead-end roads and create problems for municipal vehicles.
Actually, I have two questions basically for Steph. Is there, Eric, is there a legal responsibility for the city to take over maintenance of a road built by a private developer? Is there a requirement that we take over the road?
If it follows the process and gets planning board approval as a subdivision, and then is constructed to meet every standard that exists in the city's ordinance, then it's presumed that it will be legally accepted as a city street. But it gets proposed as that to the planning board. There's a public process. The council could certainly weigh in. There's certainly benefits to not having any new public roads. But right now, the ordinance allows it.
Do we currently how many seasonal roads do we have?
I don't know. There's a lot of them, especially around Taylor Pond.
But those are, again, are basically private roads that are maintained by private individuals. I'm thinking of something like something off Black Cat Road, the new road coming up out of Danville, coming out on.
There's so many different road statuses that I really couldn't give you any. Some of them are public easements where the public can maintain them, but doesn't have.
If somebody wanted to bring those roads back to standard, what kind of standard would they have to meet that for us to go back and take a discontinued road and reopen it?
If they're not proposing any lots, then they might be able to do that without coming back to the planning board. But they would have to meet, I believe it's chapter 46, the street design and construction standards of the ordinance. And the engineering department's responsible for that review. If they were trying to create 3 or more parcels in a 5-year period, they would absolutely have to come before this board in order to do that. And it's not an assurance, but I lost my calculation here, but it would be difficult to justify building a new road at $100 to $300 plus a linear foot for 10-acre lots. So 250 feet of frontage, we see that all the time with 1-acre rural residential lots. But a 250-foot wide lot, to meet the 10 acres would have to be almost 1,800 feet deep. So they would be really narrow sliver kind of shaped lots. But it would be possible for somebody to propose that. I think between the planning board and council and public process, there would be a discussion that follows that could help address.
And I don't recollect any road like that being proposed during my time on the planning board without a substantial residential development to justify the construction on the part of the developer. The developer pays for that road. The city might accept it, but the city doesn't pay them for the road. They're going to make all that money back on their development. And so it becomes a question of whether or not we are reasonably assured that the restrictions that we've previously discussed are enough to prevent or deter someone from building what is an incredibly expensive road in order to split up their land with the hope that it would sell. So let's say you were to split your land into 10 lots. That would require planning board approval because it's a major subdivision. And then that developer would need to be able to sell those lots with, reasonable assurance on the part of the buyer that they can build whatever it is that they want to build there. So it really becomes a question of if we believe this sort of the previous language would deter someone from doing that or not. My personal opinion, having seen what comes before the board, is that I would think it is incredibly unlikely that someone would even seek to build that sort of internal road in order to subdivide their land within the ag zone, because those lots are, without houses on them, those lots are no more valuable than any other 10-acre lot in the ag zone. The developer themselves can't put the houses up because they would have to be earning income from those lots in order to build the houses. The buyer of those lots conceivably could provide, reasonable farm plans to build, those 10 residences that meet the language of the ordinance, but that's, I don't see, I guess I don't see a developer even making, I don't see them making any money.
Acre lots that have potential for access on one road and access on another road based on how their contiguous acres are situated in order to build a road all the way through. That's the.
I understand, but I guess what I'm saying is that developer has to pay for that road up front, and then, and they have to have sort of an ROI that says they're going to make their money back on that road. And they can't make their money back by building the houses because they're not.
Wait, on North River Road, we saw all that money put into filling that lot.
Yeah.
And
With no guarantee that it will happen.
with
though.
no guarantee it would happen. And actually, as I think about that case, we can also see that the cost of road building could be decreased if the city of Auburn is pulling up pavement somewhere and wants to get rid of its reclaim. So I think it's a legitimate concern, and we shouldn't, I don't want to just, apply my own assessments of what a rational actor will do and put the world in that box.
No, I understand
I do
that.
think there's a concern.
It's a concern. I guess it becomes a question of, the entire thing becomes no matter what the outcome, it's all speculative, and you have to say, like, would a developer be likely to take that route? My personal opinion is no. What they would be much more likely to do is something like that, something similar to what happened on Woodbury, which is take, a Stetson road and then say, hey, this road already exists, and I don't care that it's like horrible, and so not, and sort of not concern themselves with the fact that the road is already substandard. It's already an accepted municipal road, and even though the municipality didn't discontinue it, it is a municipal road, and as such, you can put a residence on it. To me, that's the more concerning piece. That's the piece I see being much more likely, because that represents zero investment with regard to improvement of any road surface or construction. It's much more likely to happen given the small return that you'd expect someone to get on selling a parcel.
I don't know if this will help or not, but I think it is possible for somebody to do that with a road, but at the point where they decide to create more than a single lot split, that's when it would be in front of this board and applying the standard of whether or not it's consistent with the comp plan. All of that would happen through a public process. And I think the concern is more for somebody that would be trying to circumvent the ordinance, but if we did have somebody that truly was in front of us that was creating 5 20-acre farm lots with the infrastructure to support farming in kind of a farming community, I think that would be a big win under the ordinance. But the concern is that it would be something that is not tied to farming. I think that's sort of circumventing the ordinance. So your concern's warranted, but I do think that as soon as there's a lot split proposed beyond a single split, they'd be in front of this board, and the income standards would apply to every lot, even if they were split previously. You couldn't put a house on them unless they met the income standard. So,
In which section do you believe, as a staff member, this concept of the type of frontage would best fit? Would it be in dimensional regulations?
sorry, the type of frontage.
The type of frontage, right now we're talking about, is this, we're talking about internal roads that someone built? Are we talking about currently accepted public streets that are not maintained?
It's frontage on a city-accepted street, but there is a process to propose a new street that becomes city-accepted. When a subdivision is approved and they get their permits to proceed with constructing a street, they give the city a bond that covers the amount, a bond or cash or letter of credit, but some kind of a performance guarantee that covers the amount. If they walk away, it allows them to start selling house lots, but if they walk away, the city has access to the cash to finish constructing the street to the city standard to provide frontage for those lots. I think if there's a concern about new streets, we'd really want to look at the street standards, and the council could certainly do that, and say that maybe there's a step that goes to the council before they can even propose a new city street to the planning board as part of that review. Or maybe we don't want any new city streets, but the ordinance right now is written to allow somebody to propose a city street, and as long as they meet the construction standards, it's presumed that it would be accepted.
Well, okay. Again, though, my question is, if we were going to include that in a recommendation, would that make sense to include it in a recommendation with regard to dimensional regulations, which is the section we're looking at, or would it make sense to include it in a different section? It's abnormal to see it in the ordinance, which is why I'm asking. I don't recall ever seeing a requirement for a specific type of road frontage or the quality of the road frontage, as long as it's an accepted city road. It's always been.
City-accepted street, and then in order to have a street accepted, it has to meet certain standards.
Right, so I guess I'm saying it doesn't, that sort of requirement doesn't exist anywhere in any of the other zone regulations. So where would it make sense to put it if we were to put it here?
It exists in the definition of width and frontage, that it has to, a lot has to have the width and frontage along a city-accepted street. Frontage is defined in the ordinance outside of this ag section. It applies generally across the whole city, but what's the goal? Is the goal to say that you cannot create new streets for the purpose of frontage in the ag zone? That it's limited to existing streets?
Well, I guess that's the thing. If we're going to have that discussion, I want to make sure we're having it in the right section. So if this is a section to include it, I'll entertain that discussion like with the wider board and say, is that something we want to include? So I guess what I'm hearing, Eric, is that yes, this is where we would talk about that. So let me get to
I
the
think
point.
it would end up in a different section, but it could be part of an overall recommendation.
All right,
if the board
so
didn't want that to be allowed. We could set a date that
Yeah,
this
you know what,
frontage existed.
I'm going to suggest that the board put that as one of the recommendations, additional recommendations at the end, if that's something that we want to put, that we want to put in. And that with this section right here, we focus just on this language.
Yeah, I agree, that's where it would fit.
Looking at this, I'm going to guess that the primary recommendation is that that section 60-146, 1 and 2 proposed language the reduction in 50% income objective does not apply here. That I would argue that the planning board objectives do not apply to this section. So that we would make a recommendation saying that the planning board objectives do not apply to this section. However, the date referring to January 1st, 2018 should be amended to, our recommendation is that it be amended to the date of the proclamation by Mayor Labonte to create the original ad hoc committee. And am I fair in saying that that's really the discussion on this section? And that that's primarily the entirety of a recommendation that we would make? Is there any dissent with regard to that?
It does.
Would you be willing to make the motion?
Sure. I make a motion that we accept 60-146 dimensional regulations as written, with the change only being in section 1C on the date of the lots existing of being returned to the date of the original ag study under Mayor Labonte's administration.
There's a motion by Mr. Carrier. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Engler. Is there discussion? All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion for the recommendation carries unanimously. Our final public hearing of the night is looking at an amendment to Chapter 60, Article 12, Division 4, Lake Auburn Watershed Overlay District, Section 60-952 and Section 60-953. We'll proceed with this public hearing the same way we did with the previous public hearings.
I think we covered this one in some detail at the beginning of the meeting, but essentially the proposed changes to the Lake Auburn Overlay District are intended to keep the standard the same, the 50% standard as it exists today within the Lake Auburn Watershed Overlay. We talked quickly about the way that the language was drafted to apply to residential dwellings and wasn't specific to residential dwellings in the Agriculture and Resource Protection District when they're also in the Lake Auburn Overlay District. Should be clarified to show that this residential standard of being accessory to farming with a 50% income is not going to apply in existing residential districts that are in the Lake Auburn watershed. So we made a few changes to this based on feedback from the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission. Jim Bross is here tonight as well. The only remaining change, again, would be to make it clear that this is within the Lake Auburn Watershed District and the Ag Resource Protection District. All of the other standards remain the same as they apply today in the watershed. So.
Questions from the board to staff? None? Are you satisfied?
Yeah, I think it'll be more, my question might be more.
At this point, then, I'll entertain a motion to open the public input section of this hearing.
So moved.
Motion by Mrs. Boss,
Second.
seconded by Mr. Engler. All those in favor? Is there anyone from the public that would like to speak to this topic?
Kathy Shaw, Valley View Farm, Soapers Mill Road, da-da-da-da-da. I just want to reiterate that as important as our public drinking water supply is, I understand that. It's equally important for our resource protection zone that the agricultural zone is. It's just as important as that. We should have as much emphasis on preserving and protecting that land as we do for the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Overlay District. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else from the public that would like to speak to this topic?
Thank you to the Planning Board, Jim Pross once again, on behalf of the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission. Just a few points that I'd like to make with regard to the proposed ordinance that you're all considering tonight. Thank you for your time in dealing with the whole entire ag zone issue. I know that everybody's been dealing with it in City Hall for several years now, it seems, and here we are coming up on the end of this process. As I indicated earlier, really the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission only cares about this ordinance insofar as the remaining proposed ordinances are adopted. So I hope that the City Council will take this up last and finally when it does consider the ordinances in turn and in order. It was said earlier that the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission opposed the proposed amendments to the ag zone, and I don't think that that's really a fair characterization. The Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission adopted a resolution in April of this past year indicating that any changes to the ag zone should be limited to the areas of Auburn outside the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Overlay District. That overlay exists for the specific purpose of helping to protect the watershed and the sensitive ecosystem that exists there so that we could maintain the present quality and volume of potable water that's supplied from by the Lake Auburn watershed. And so there's this unique interest that the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission has as an independent body established by an interlocal agreement by several municipalities and quasi-municipal organizations, including the Water District. At the heart of its objective is to serve as a body that implements the bylaws that are promulgated by the Auburn Water District to protect the waters of Lake Auburn, to help ensure that the waiver of filtration is not interrupted due to unintended consequences of development. One of the bylaws established by the Auburn Water District states that the existing zoning and land uses that are within the watershed overlay district. So the standards within the ag zone, the standards within the low density rural residential district, all of those standards that exist are adequate to protect the water supply as it is. So the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission is uniquely charged with ensuring that there are no deviations from those underlying definitions and standards that apply to those zones that underlie the overlay. And so what we have here with the proposed amendments to the ag zone is really the most significant proposed change, sweeping change really, to any of those zoning districts in recent history, certainly since the creation of the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission. So it has worked with city staff in recent weeks to ensure that there's some mechanism to guarantee that within that overlay district that no changes are made to that underlying zoning. And we feel that, and there are a number of ways that the city could go about doing that, but we feel that at the end of the day, what's being proposed with the ordinance that you're considering right now really is adequate to make sure that there are no changes to the definitions and the performance standards within that underlying zone. It maintains the 50% income rule and also the 10 acre lot restriction. So we feel that between those two considerations that there's going to be adequate protection for the water supply. And I think that if you look at the standards that you're applying here, you could go right down 2 through 5 and tick those off and say, yes, this really does meet the requirements and checks those boxes for each one of those standards that you're weighing against. The only one that it doesn't check off, I guess, is, in my opinion anyway, is the reduction in the 50% rule, right? Because we're preserving that here. But I think that that's for a unique function that is recognized within the purpose of the watershed overlay district itself within the ordinance. So I don't think that it's really representing much of a deviation from what's already there in seeking to preserve the existing standards within the ag zone. And if the city council is to make the proposed changes to the ag zone definitions to allow a special exception, we think it's important that there is this section within the overlay district to specifically prevent those changes from going into effect in the lands within the overlay district that are currently zoned agriculture and resource protection. And I agree with staff, with Mr. Cousins, that it would be an important technical change that perhaps you all could recommend to simply amend the title so that it says residential dwellings within the agricultural resource protection district, so that it's clear that the intent here is really just with regard to those properties zoned as such within the overlay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else from the public that would like to speak on this issue?
Michelle Melarano, Trap Road. Just a quick clarification that on that list that I gave you, I did list the Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission due to an article on April 25th stating Lake Auburn Watershed Protection Commission opposes new agricultural zone rules. That's where I got it from.
I understand. I believe those were previous rules, though. Thank you for your clarification. Is there anyone else from the public that would like to speak? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to close the public input section of the hearing.
So moved.
I'll give it to Mr. Carrier. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. You know what? I feel like we'll give it to Mrs. Bosser. All right. So a motion has been made. Second. All those in favor? All right. Is there discussion with regard to the specific intent of this section, as well as the suggestion that it read residential dwellings in the agriculture and resource protection zone?
So I always favor being specific with language, so I would agree with amending the title to specify what the ag zone, whatever the full name of it is.
I would agree with amending the title in that way. I'm fine with this.
I would assume that most of us would agree. We heard from Mr. Prost that this would, in his opinion, tick off number 2, 3, 4, and 5 in our planning board objectives. I'm not sure that it would be appropriate for us to apply those planning board objectives to this ordinance, primarily because when the planning board created those recommendations, it was specific to amendments in the agriculture and resource protection zone. So we can certainly use these and say that we believe these also apply to the overlay, or we could simply say that the intent of the overlay is to protect the drinking water, and that we believe that maintaining the status quo there does that, as it has done since the early 60s.
I would say this also doesn't represent an amendment to the ag zone, right?
Right, that's what I'm saying. This doesn't represent an amendment to the ag zone, which is why I don't think we should use the planning board objectives 1 through 5 that we've been using up to this point. I think we need to make a clarification with a finding that whether or not we believe this will continue the protections that are currently guaranteed under that overlay. My personal opinion is that yes, they will, and we have the historical data to back it up. Actually, this is the only point in our discussion that we've had the data to indicate that this really will stop additional growth in that overlay zone.
And I could just add a comment that I'm trying to pull it up quickly because it is a little different, but environmental goal number 1 in the comprehensive plan, I believe, is to protect the high quality of the water in the Lake Auburn watershed. So there are other pieces that would certainly support you doing that.
All right. I don't hear a lot of dissent, so I'll ask for a motion at this point.
You guys, come on. I make a motion that we accept the amended title, Division 4, and accept the overall amendment as is written.
The amended title to include residential dwellings in the agricultural resource protection zone? Is that what you
Yes.
mean? Okay.
And accept it ad hoc.
Do you have a specific finding as to why we believe it's appropriate?
The specific finding is the protection of the drinking water, City of Auburn.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Duvall. Discussion? All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion for the recommendation carries unanimously. We are not done. We mentioned earlier in this process that we believe we are going to have additional recommendations, and I think they should be titled as such. Each of these recommendations should be taken individually. The first recommendation that I can recall is to recommend to the City Council that they direct staff to track any growth or changes in the ag zone as we move forward, and that we highly suggest they do this working with the agriculture committee. Is that something that Mr. Walker?
Council has to direct the manager, not staff.
Okay, thank you very much for the clarification. So our recommendations should be that the council direct the manager to track, because the manager will ask staff to track development in the zone, and that we highly recommend they do so in conjunction with the Ag Committee. Is that a recommendation that we?
Yes.
Okay. Can someone turn that into a motion?
We want to track development, but we also want to track land use, correct? We want to see if this actually increases farming. So that if we're evaluating the impact of the zone changes, we want to know what the current status is.
You should, if you,
Well, I'm asking, is that, are we in agreement that that's part of our?
I understood development to mean sort of land use as well, and I would assume that everyone else sort of.
Yeah, and we are talking about the agricultural zone, so yeah, track the development in the agricultural zone.
If you're making the motion, I would suggest possibly saying something like track development and land use, if you want to make that clear.
I move that we recommend that we direct City Council to direct the city manager to implement an evaluation process that would review development and land use in the ag zone.
Second.
May I add a?
Yes.
And that we suggest they do so in conjunction with the Agriculture Committee? Do we want to add that in?
Yes. Yes, I would accept that. And that start as soon as the Agricultural Committee is in place.
So that's the motion. There was a second before I.
Second.
So you'll have to accept that as well because you
Accept
seconded.
it.
Okay, all right. Is there discussion? All those in favor? All those against? None being. That recommendation, that motion for that recommendation carries. Additional recommendations.
Time frame for review of the.
Right, that there be a time frame for review of the impact of any changes. We can suggest that that was taken up by the previous recommendation, or we could say that the previous recommendation really wasn't enough, that we say that we recommend that City Council ask the manager to provide an update on development and land use changes in the zone within 1 calendar year of adoption of any changes to the amendment. You could say something like that.
I would make a motion that we suggest to the council that they direct the manager to have staff review growth and changes in the committee, or, God Lord, in the agricultural zone, and that it be done on an annual basis and be part of a review staff for,
Are you implying a report to the council?
well, yes, because the agricultural committee, and then we can actually have this be part of it, it is that the staff and the committee provide that information back to the manager so that he can come back annually and say, this is what we've noticed since the implementation of the stuff, and that starts our time clock for us being able to review pertinent information for here in Auburn.
So to clean it up, what I heard was directing council, asking council, we recommend that council direct the manager to undergo an annual review in conjunction with the
Staff and committee.
with staff and ag committee, and present their findings
Of any changes of growth and changes in the ag zone.
to the council. Any changes in
Development and land use.
development and land use to the council on an annual basis. That's
That's it.
That's the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Second made by Mrs. Boss. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? All those opposed? Being none, it's getting late.
Were we going to
That
make,
motion for recommendation carries unanimously.
were we going to make a recommendation about the use on the roads?
Well, that would be the next topic. So, is that something that we want to?
I'd like to slip in an additional recommendation.
Yeah.
Before we get to the road one. I would like to recommend that the calculation for the income standard be clarified. What's the numerator and what's the denominator? The current draft, effectively by including this Auburn median income thing, says that the denominator can be that number. I think it's like $46,000, right? The numerator, we really need to define. Is it profit or is it sales? Does that monetary value have to be generated on the parcel in question, or could some portion thereof come from a different parcel that the farm's business is already farming? That was a question from the public tonight. I think that we should really lay that out.
I would.
Not we as in the planning.
No. I hear you.
But it should be laid out.
Well, I think the way the language is written, it says the parcel. So I understood the question, and it was a good question. But if I had to hazard a guess, because it says the parcel, then it would be that specific parcel. It would not be, and that's also how we do sort of other things as well. You know, like it's if I own an adjacent parcel, they treat them as the same. But if I owned a parcel, say down the road, they're like two different properties.
That's a reasonable point. Nonetheless, there's been so much energy talking about what the percent should be, but everybody needs to be on the same page on how it's calculated.
Well, so I think that's a good recommendation. My question is, does the board feel we captured that in our earlier recommendation with regard to the language, in which we said that the language needs to be written to clarify whether it is gross or net, and that be applied to both household income and the farm income. So the question is, do you feel that was captured in that earlier recommendation, or do you feel that an additional recommendation is required?
That's a good question. I'm not 100% certain.
Well,
Actually.
since you're not 100% certain, if you feel strongly about it, I don't think it's unreasonable to make a pointed recommendation.
I think
that
we
any
should
description of income be described consistently and clearly, like that in and of itself.
Yes, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Is that the recommendation that you'd like to make?
Yes.
Are you making a motion?
Yes, I'd like to make a motion to include a recommendation that all references to income, whether household, farm, personal, be defined and it be extremely clear what they're actually referring to.
Is there a second?
Are we asking for not only clarity but consistency? So that we choose one? Let's see.
Clarity.
I think clarity is what's most important.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, is there discussion? This is something we talked about earlier, so I would assume there'll be some discussion on this, but.
So just to clarify what you mean by clarity, as it's as it's currently written, it is, both things are very clear,
Right.
but they are inconsistent. It says household income and it says gross farm revenue in the same sentence. Those are not consistent, but they are very clear. So do we actually mean clear or do we mean consistent?
I would suggest that we mean consistent.
So far, with the drafts that we have, because these are not staffs, we've been trying to work with the council to come to some consensus and put forward a draft that meets their expectations. We have proposed in the language measuring gross farm revenue against off-farm income. So farm is not profit, it's overall revenue without an accounting of expenses, and income is the family's net income on their tax return.
But the data that we have from DACF, from Stephanie Gilbert, that's net for Androscoggin County, not.
Yes, that's absolutely correct, but
Right.
the standard in the draft, I believe, is very intentional as gross. But that's an important distinction that everybody should be comfortable with, because
Right.
it's clear, but it's not consistent with the average net farm income.
See that they be consistent. Going once.
So further discussion on this topic, I guess.
I mean, I guess I would prefer that we be consistent, because
Okay.
part of the reason I think there's confusion is that we have not been.
So is there any further discussion? So there is a motion, and I know it doesn't happen often on the planning board, because we tend to do a pretty good job building consensus, but if you don't, it's okay to, what's the word I'm looking for? Be
Well,
against the motion, I guess.
yeah, I think Matsu brings up a great point. This doesn't make much sense as it's written, maybe. At least 30% of the total annual household income of the farm occupants. So that's 30% of the family's household income.
So that's net, that's what they get taxed on.
That's the net that they're being taxed on. Or they got to do $14,000 in agricultural sales.
That's what it's saying.
So it is quite inconsistent.
It's very clear, it's just not consistent. Although we made a motion earlier regarding the consistency. That was part of our earlier motion that
Okay.
they be
Well,
consistent.
maybe, but the other reason I'm bringing this up at the end is because I really have a nagging concern, and maybe it's misplaced because it's my personal confusion, that there's been collective confusion running through this discourse, that's all. So I think we should flag that, because if we as a city are confusing profit and revenue of the farm businesses as we try to regulate them, we're not doing them any favors.
Well, there's definitely not a clarity with it, because last night at the board meeting, they were arguing about 30% of this, 30% of that. Is it this, is it that? So obviously there's confusion on everybody's part as to what exactly we're talking about. Clarity in the consistency of how we do this, then I think that we should do it, and if they can adopt it if they want, or they can go their own way. Either way, it's.
So the motion is that there be clarity in describing the income requirements. There be further clarity.
Can I make an amendment to the motion? Is that allowed?
You can ask for a friendly amendment, and then the person that made the amendment can choose to accept it or not.
Okay, so I'd like to make a friendly amendment with the change clarity to consistency. or add consistency?
Claire, yeah, I think we can add them. I accept that.
Just remove ambiguity is like,
And this, who has seconded that? Do you also accept that
agree.
friendly amendment?
I will agree.
Is there any further discussion? Okay. All those in favor of sending that recommendation to the city council? All those opposed?
So by consistency, what I guess, because I have to write this up, what I'm hearing is you want a net farm income standard measured against a net household income standard, and not a gross farm revenue standard measured against a net household income standard. Because I think it's very clear that that's what it is, but they're two different values, very different values potentially, when you're talking gross versus net.
I think regardless of, I think consistency is if the denominator is Auburn median income versus the family's actual household income, regardless, it should either be profit or the gross sales that's compared against that. That's a serious inconsistency in the way it's written. It doesn't make sense that it's $14,000 sales or 30% of income.
But the way to make that consistent would be to measure the net farm income against the net household, because we're going to have access to net household from a tax return, and that was the intent, the way this was written.
Conversely, I think we're also agreeing that we could say it could be the gross farm income compared to the
Gross sales in both cases.
gross household income and gross median income.
But whether it's net or gross, they should be the same? Is that what I'm hearing?
I think that's what we're hearing, yeah.
Well, I would argue they should be the
Gross to
same, and they should, if it were gross sales or revenue in both instances, it really helps to address some other concerns we heard around, cost accounting and reinvestment issues and the like.
Okay, let me, I understand what you, I understand what Eric was trying to say earlier, right? Is the idea that if we go gross farm income, okay, instead of net farm income, it means that's what they could gross, but then they could, say, invest all of that back into the farm and derive zero pocketable income
Right.
and still qualify. So I think we understand where that's going, and I recognize that there's a value in doing that because it allows the farmer to reinvest that money into their operation without having to without it being
Kind of counted against
taxable
them.
income, right?
But it also allows for, and I think this is going to be necessary in the case of most farms, that some of the off-farm income is being invested in the farm, especially at the beginning. Even if it's not it may be a long-term thing that's happening. But I just want to make sure we think through how those things play out as either supporting or not supporting farming, and which numbers are
Well,
used.
I guess I hear what you're saying, and my personal inclination is, I hear what you're saying, and I'm saying like, no, that's fine. Like, I want you to, this should be the income you're walking away with. That's my, so I hear what you're saying, and I understand what you're trying to say.
Right
and it
now-
does make sense, given a particular argument. My
Right
personal
now, that's
opinion
not
is,
what it says, though.
Right, no, but
It's
my
absolutely-
personal opinion is such that if you really want to ensure that someone is deriving an income from what they're doing, then you need to ensure that they're walking away, that you're measuring what they're walking away with, not. That's my personal, so.
Long-term, it seems the net is the only thing that's sustainable. You can't invest in something and lose forever. And, but I think that the council has been clear in the discussions, and it's in the language. It is gross farm revenue.
I'll say this, that was our recommendation, and I know that staff is.
No, and I'm fine with
It-
whatever recommendation
and-
comes
and,
back, but I want to make sure I write it down.
I'll be there to provide that recommendation to council, and you guys can make any argument that you would like.
I just want to make
yeah.
sure I know how to write it down. I'm fine with whatever
No,
recommendation
I
you're
think you
making.
understood it correctly, that the planning board really feels that there would be clarity in using either all gross or all net,
All gross or all net.
that it needs to be consistent and very clear. I think that was the takeaway. And I understand staff's position with regard to why they wrote it the way they wrote it.
I'm not trying to take a position, I'm trying to understand.
Yeah.
If we're changing one to gross or net, or changing both, or I get now if it's all gross or all net, and that's the recommendation I get, that's easy, I got it.
All right. Well, there's the roads. Do we want to give a recommendation on roads?
Yeah. There had been concern from the public. Do we want to address the discontinued roads or other roads that are being input for property, can't say it now, roads that are being proposed for possible development? Do we want to include anything in there for the recommendations, that it come back to planning board, go to council specifically, be reviewed by engineering? Is there any consistency with a recommendation for that so that it's addressed?
Any road that's proposed is going to have to be, if they're building it to city standard with the assumption that the city's going to take it over, that's going to go to engineering anyway. It wouldn't come to the planning board unless they split off parcels. So anyone right now, I mean, I could build a road through my lot that would meet city standards, and that would be a really silly thing to do, but I could do it, and it would, as long as engineering signs off that yes, I built this thing correctly, I go ahead and get it accepted as a city road, but it doesn't represent something that would need to come to the planning board. It would only come to the planning board if there's a subdivision, and so that subdivision is going to be creation of, correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but I believe it's 3 lots within a 5-year period.
Yes, so you could split once without coming to planning board. If you split a second time, it creates the 3rd lot.
So that would trigger a minor subdivision review, and I forget what the, off the top of my head, I guess I could look, but there's also a major subdivision review that's triggered by further subdividing within a 10-year period, I believe.
I think it's more than 5 lots, or if it includes a road, it becomes a new road.
Talk at once.
Right? Yeah.
Just a suggestion, throwing it out there. That answers the question.
All right, well, it seems like...
I mean, I am not well-versed enough in how road creation is represented in our current ordinance and zoning. I brought the issue up because it came up in numerous places. However, could we include a provision that says any new roads or any roads that have been discontinued that would like to be, whatever the terminology is, brought back, that are in the ag zone, come before the planning board first for approval? Something simple that's just like any new road in the ag zone or any discontinued road or currently not used road that would like to be brought back, come before planning board.
We have to be careful about the second one, because a discontinued road really is a discontinued road and isn't owned by the city. So like if the city discontinued the road, they would have to go to the city council to have it reaccepted. But there's a difference. You could have what is an accepted city road or street that the municipality, for one reason or another, chooses not to maintain, but it's still an accepted street. It hasn't been abandoned, so it's like they wouldn't have to come back to anyone to do anything on it. But if it had been abandoned and discontinued, they'd have to go back to the council anyway because it had been abandoned by the municipality. Does that make sense? We have to be careful about
Right.
the adjectives we use to describe it.
Right. And I don't have those adjectives, which is why I'm
I know it's
silent
difficult
on the
because
issue.
it's a complicated.
Well, if it's something that, I mean, anybody that's going to build a new road, as you said, would either have to be extremely
It'll come
rich
before us anyways.
to do with their money, or anybody that comes back and asks for a road to be reclaimed by the city would have to take it to the council and ask for specific reasons. So I think with that, we would get a good enough review in regards to the reasoning, and staff would be able to respond to anything that any reasons why the road had been discontinued to begin with. So I think we may cover it with just that.
Good. Is there further discussion or any
I think I'm
proposed-
satisfied at this point.
Are there any additional recommendations from the board? From any board members? Any additional discussion on the topic? Yes, Mr. Gray.
Sorry, Joe Gray. Just, I know you can't encapsulate this in regulation, but we need to be humane. I appreciate the fact that you went for the 2 years with a farm plan as opposed to the 2 through 5, but there are circumstances where you can lose everything and not generate income. And you might be a very dedicated farmer, but you've lost your butt in 1 year, and that, what you did was good, but it can also come back. So if there's a way that you can encapsulate some sort of human oversight to this so that,
Act of God.
Well, I think with regard to that, that was the $2,000, which we're suggesting should not be 2,000, but should be rather tied to whatever the state standard is. So if the state standard changes, that standard changes. If I remember correctly, that refers to gross. So that would encapsulate someone that sort of derived
Just for
$2,000 in
example,
income, but
there was a
had
pig
to
farm-
spend $10,000 on their property.
there was a pig farm in Minot. The guy had 700 pigs, and he got a disease in his barns. So he had to get rid of all 700 pigs. He lost his market. It took him at least 2 years to bleach and clean all those barns out. He had no income coming for those 2 years. Now, he got loans and whatnot. So I'm saying it's an extreme case, but it can happen. And I don't want somebody to lose their butt because of that.
I think that would be taken up by,
I mean, Councilor Walker said earlier that this is all because of, it's not true, but it's because of
no, I recollect.
stance by the
Look,
city,
I
so.
recollect the Victorian on Pownell Road, and it was a very different situation. That was
Yes.
that was really about a snafu on a land surveyor's part, not with regard to what she was trying to do. For clarity, though, it is a good point, and I think that's the sort of thing where someone would appeal a decision. Someone would appeal any decision made on the basis of the zoning ordinance, right? So this income is based on the zoning ordinance. All of those appeals go to the Zoning Board of Appeals, and they do have the power to provide a variance to zoning ordinance if the person seeking that variance is able to demonstrate that that variance is required for something that was out of their control. And I think that's an example of how I would hope that would be handled, that would go to the Zoning Board of Appeals. They would say, this was out of your control, here's your variance for this year. They would put a time period on it, and then we'd move on. So I think that's an important point, but I'm fairly confident that we have mechanisms already to deal with that.
If we can do dimensional variances through the Board of Appeals, but I think as long as it wasn't the 2 years prior to the person applying for the new house permit, if they already had the house, then I think they could also come to the planning board and say, look, last year I lost everything, and it was because of this disease, it was beyond my control, and they could obtain relief that way.
Well, this is the other thing, too. This would be a special exception, and anyone coming before the board to seek a special exception can ask for a waiver or a variance for a requirement, right? So we could also do that in process. Yeah.
And even the larger lots could come
Yep.
to this board and explain it was beyond their control.
Exactly, yeah. All right, any other recommendations? No? All right, I think I'm super proud of us. We did this in a very civil manner. All right. At this point, we always have a public input section of our meetings. This is a special meeting. It was not put on here by the city council, but I will open it as any public input before we adjourn.
Thank you very much for a really civil, I think, welcome.
Thank you. At this point, I'll seek a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
So,
Second.
and seconded, all those in favor? All right. You will not have to word your own motions anymore.